Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The thing about driving through Montana in February is that the cold doesn't just surround you. It becomes part of you, settling into your bones like an unwelcome passenger that refuses to leave. Hollis McCrae had been hauling freight across the northern states for 16 years, and he'd learned to respect the winter in ways that most people never would. The cold up here wasn't the same cold you felt in other places. It was alive somehow, with intentions of its own, and it would kill you without hesitation if you gave it the chance. Hollis was 3 hours into his run from Billings to Great Falls, hauling a load of industrial equipment that was already 2 days behind schedule because of weather delays. The forecast had called for light snow and moderate winds, the kind of conditions that any experienced winter driver could handle without much trouble. But the forecast had been wrong. The way forecasts always seem to be wrong when you needed them to be right. The snow had started falling harder around midnight, and by 1 in the morning it was coming down so thick that Hollis could barely see 20 feet beyond his headlights. The wind was howling across the plains with enough force to push his fully loaded rig sideways on the highway, and the temperature had dropped to 18 below zero, according to the gauge on his dashboard. Highway 87 stretched out before him like a white tunnel that led to nowhere. The road markers buried under drifts of snow that made it nearly impossible to tell where the pavement ended and the shoulder began. Hollis kept his speed down to about 35 miles per hour, both hands locked on the wheel, fighting the constant pressure of the crosswind that wanted to shove his truck into the ditch. He'd driven this route more times than he could count, knew every curve and grade by heart, but tonight the familiar highway felt different somehow. Wrong in a way that he couldn't quite define, but that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The radio had been acting strange for the past hour, cycling through stations on its own and picking up fragments of conversations that didn't quite make sense. Trucker chatter from CB frequencies that shouldn't have been accessible on his AM/FM radio, weather reports for towns that Hollis had never heard of, and occasional bursts of static that almost sounded like someone trying to speak through layers of interference. Hollis had tried switching the radio off twice, but each time it would turn itself back on within a few minutes, always tuned to a different station playing the same kind of distorted audio. At mile marker 147, Hollis saw the first vehicle he'd encountered in over an hour. It was sitting on the shoulder of the northbound lane, hazard lights flashing weakly through the driving snow. The vehicle looked like a pickup truck, though it was hard to tell for certain with the snow accumulation covering most of its features. What struck Hollis as odd was that the truck appeared to be completely dark inside. No dome light visible. No silhouette of a driver waiting for help. Just an empty vehicle sitting alone in the storm with its hazards blinking in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. Hollis slowed down as he passed the truck, looking for any sign of the driver, but the cab appeared to be completely abandoned. He could see that the windows were partially rolled down despite the freezing temperature, and snow had drifted into the interior through the openings. The truck looked like it had been sitting there for days rather than hours, which didn't make sense given that the state patrol usually cleared abandoned vehicles pretty quickly, especially during winter storms. Hollis considered stopping to check if anyone needed help, but something about the scene felt wrong enough that he decided to keep moving and call it in to the highway patrol instead. He grabbed his CB radio and keyed the microphone, broadcasting on channel 19. "This is northbound driver at mile marker 147 on Highway 87. Got an abandoned pickup on the shoulder. Hazards on, no driver visible. Looks like it's been sitting a while. Anyone copy?" The response came back immediately, but it wasn't what Hollis expected. Instead of the usual dispatcher or highway patrol acknowledgement, He heard his own voice coming through the speaker. The words were identical to what he had just said, but there was something off about the tone, something flat and emotionless that made it sound like a recording being played back on damaged equipment. Hollis felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He stared at the CB radio for a long moment, then keyed the microphone again. "This is Hollis McCrae requesting radio check. Anyone out there?" Again, his own voice came back through the speaker, repeating his words exactly, but with that same disturbing quality that made it sound both familiar and completely wrong. It was like listening to himself speak from the bottom of a frozen lake, the words muffled and distorted by layers of ice and water. The storm was getting worse by the minute, and Hollis knew he needed to find a place to pull over and wait out the worst of it. Driving in these conditions was dangerous enough without the added distraction of malfunctioning radio equipment and abandoned vehicles that didn't make sense. He remembered there was a rest area coming up in about 15 miles, a decent-sized facility with covered parking and bathroom facilities that would be a good place to sit tight until the visibility improved. The rest area was usually pretty busy, even in bad weather, with other truckers and travelers taking shelter from the storm, so Hollis wouldn't be completely isolated while he waited. But as the miles passed and Hollis approached what should have been the rest area, he found only empty highway stretching endlessly through the blowing snow. The blue signs that should have announced the facility's approach never appeared, and when Hollis checked his GPS, he discovered that according to the satellite navigation, he was driving through an area where no rest stops existed. The GPS showed Highway 87 as a straight line through empty territory with no services of any kind for the next 60 miles. Hollis knew for certain that the rest area existed because he'd stopped there dozens of times over the years, had even had breakfast there just 3 weeks earlier on his last run through this area. The radio crackled to life again, and this time it wasn't his own voice that came through the speaker. It was a woman's voice, soft and distant, speaking words that Hollis couldn't quite make out through the layers of static. He turned up the volume and leaned closer, trying to understand what she was saying, and gradually the words became clearer. She was calling someone's name, repeating it over and over with increasing desperation. "Hollis. Hollis McCrae. Can you hear me, Hollis? I need you to listen very carefully." Hollis grabbed the CB microphone with a hand that had started to shake slightly. "This is Hollis McCrae. Who is this? How do you know my name?" The woman's voice continued as if she hadn't heard his response, still speaking in that same distant tone that made it sound like she was broadcasting from somewhere very far away. "You need to turn around, Hollis. You're going the wrong direction. The road ahead isn't safe. Turn around while you still can." The problem was that turning around wasn't an option, not on this narrow highway in the middle of a blizzard with a fully loaded trailer behind him. Hollis would need at least a quarter-mile of clear road to execute a safe turnaround, and the visibility was so poor that he couldn't see more than 20 feet in any direction. Even if he wanted to follow the woman's advice, which he wasn't sure he did, the physical reality of his situation made it impossible. He was committed to moving forward until he found a place where he could safely stop or turn around. "Who are you?" Hollis asked again, but the woman didn't answer his question. Instead, she said something that made his blood run cold despite the heater blasting warm air into the cab. "I'm at mile marker 147, Hollis. I've been waiting here for a long time. I saw you drive past. Why didn't you stop to help me?" Hollis realized with growing unease that the woman was claiming to be at the abandoned pickup truck he had passed nearly 30 minutes earlier. But there had been no one visible at that location. No woman standing in the snow waiting for assistance. Just an empty vehicle with its hazards flashing. The wind slammed into the side of Hollis's truck with enough force to push him partially into the oncoming lane, and he had to fight the wheel to keep the rig under control. The temperature gauge on his dashboard had dropped to 23 below zero, and ice was forming on the inside of his windows despite the heater running at full blast. Hollis cranked the defroster up higher and wiped at the windshield with his gloved hand, trying to improve his visibility, but the ice just kept forming faster than he could clear it away. The cold was seeping into the cab through cracks and seals that should have been airtight, as if the storm outside had become strong enough to force its way through the truck's defenses. At mile marker 152, Hollis saw the pickup truck again. It was sitting on the shoulder in exactly the same position as before, hazard lights flashing in that same slow rhythm. Hollis knew that was impossible because he had been driving steadily north for the past 30 minutes and should have been miles away from the abandoned vehicle by now. But there it was, unmistakable in his headlights, with the same snow accumulation in the interior and the same dark, empty cab. According to his odometer and GPS, he had traveled nearly 6 miles since passing the truck the first time, yet somehow he was looking at it again as if he had never left. The woman's voice came through the radio again, and this time there was an edge of anger in her tone. "You drove past me again, Hollis. That's twice now that you've left me here in the cold. Don't you understand that I need help? Don't you care that I'm freezing out here?" Hollis stared at the pickup truck as he slowly drove past it for what he was certain was the second time, and this time he saw something that made his heart slam against his ribs. There was a figure standing beside the truck, barely visible through the blowing snow. A woman in what looked like a white coat or dress, standing perfectly still despite the wind that was strong enough to knock a grown man off his feet. Hollis hit his brakes instinctively, the truck skidding slightly on the ice-covered highway before the tires found purchase and brought him to a stop about 50 yards past the woman. He sat there for a long moment, engine idling, watching the figure in his side mirror. She wasn't moving, wasn't waving for help, wasn't doing anything that a normal person stranded in a blizzard would do. She was just standing there beside the pickup truck, facing in his direction, though Hollis couldn't make out her features through the distance and the snow. Every instinct that Hollis had developed over 16 years of a long-haul driving was screaming at him not to get out of his truck, not to approach that woman, not to do anything except put his rig in gear and drive away as fast as the road conditions would allow. But the rational part of his mind was telling him that he couldn't just leave someone stranded in weather like this. The temperature was lethal, and no one could survive outside for more than a few minutes without proper shelter and cold weather gear. If there was really a woman standing out there in the storm, she would be dead within the hour if someone didn't help her. Hollis grabbed his heavy parka from the sleeper berth and pulled it on, then added his insulated gloves and a wool face mask that covered everything except his eyes. He took a powerful flashlight from the emergency kit under his seat and climbed down from the cab, immediately feeling the full force of the wind and cold that his truck had been protecting him from. The cold hit him like a physical blow, so intense that it made his lungs ache with each breath. The wind was howling across the plains with a sound that was almost human, rising and falling in pitch like voices crying out in the distance. Hollis turned on his flashlight and started walking back toward the pickup truck, his boots crunching through snow that was already knee-deep in places. The woman was still standing beside the truck, motionless as a statue, and as Hollis got closer he could see that she was wearing what appeared to be a white nightgown, rather than any kind of winter clothing. Her feet were bare, planted in snow that should have caused immediate frostbite, and her hair was hanging loose around her shoulders, whipping in the wind, but not in the way that living hair would move. "Ma'am," Hollis called out, his voice muffled by the face mask and stolen by the wind almost before the words left his mouth. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond, didn't turn to look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence in any way. Hollis took another few steps closer, raising his flashlight to get a better look at her face, and that's when he saw her eyes. They were completely white, no iris or pupil visible, just blank white orbs that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. Her skin was pale beyond anything that could be natural, with a bluish tint that suggested advanced hypothermia or something far worse. Hollis stopped walking, his hand tightening on the flashlight. "Ma'am, I'm going to call for help. You need to get out of this cold." But even as he said the words, he was backing away slowly, returning toward his truck, because every fiber of his being was telling him that what he was looking at wasn't a woman in need of help. It was something else entirely, something that wore the shape of a woman but wasn't human in any meaningful sense. The figure's lips moved, and Hollis heard her voice carried on the wind, the same voice that had been speaking to him through his radio. "Why do you keep leaving, Hollis? Why won't you stay with me? It's so cold out here. I've been cold for such a long time." Hollis turned and ran back to his truck, his boots slipping on the ice-covered pavement, his breath coming in short gasps that sent clouds of vapor into the freezing air. He could hear footsteps behind him, crunching through the snow with a steady rhythm that matched his own pace exactly, always maintaining the same distance no matter how fast he moved. He didn't look back, didn't want to see how close the thing was, just focused on reaching his truck and getting the door closed and locked behind him. He grabbed the door handle and yanked it open, pulling himself up into the cab with a strength born of pure adrenaline, and slammed the door shut so hard that the whole truck shook. The footsteps stopped directly outside his door. Hollis sat frozen in his seat, staring straight ahead, afraid to look at the window beside him. He could hear breathing, slow and steady, just on the other side of the thin barrier of glass and metal that separated him from whatever was standing outside. Then a hand pressed against the window, pale fingers splayed against the frost-covered glass, and the woman's voice spoke directly into his mind rather than through his ears. "You saw me, Hollis. You can't unsee me now. Every time you drive this road, every time you pass mile marker 147, I'll be here waiting, and eventually you'll stop running. Eventually, you'll understand that the cold isn't something to fear. It's something to embrace." Hollis jammed his truck into gear and floored the accelerator, the tires spinning on the ice before finally catching and propelling him forward. He didn't look in his mirrors, didn't check to see if the woman was still standing there or if she had moved. He just drove, pushing his speed up to 45 miles per hour despite the dangerous conditions, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and whatever he had encountered. The radio was screaming now, not words, but a high-pitched wail that sounded like wind whistling through a canyon or souls crying out in torment. Hollis reached out and ripped the radio from its mounting, tearing wires loose and throwing the entire unit into the sleeper berth where he wouldn't have to listen to it anymore. But even with the radio destroyed, he could still hear her voice. It was coming from everywhere now, from the heater vents and the speakers in the ceiling, from the very structure of the truck itself. "You can't escape, Hollis. The road is mine. Every mile of it belongs to me now. Drive as far as you want. Drive until your fuel runs out. You'll still be here with me, on my highway, in my storm." Hollis checked his GPS and discovered that despite having driven for nearly 10 minutes at high speed, he was still showing as being at mile marker 152. The truck was moving, the scenery was changing, the odometer was counting miles, but according to the satellite navigation, he hadn't actually gone anywhere at all. He was trapped in a loop, driving through the same stretch of highway over and over again, unable to move forward or backward, frozen in place by forces he couldn't understand or fight against. And somewhere behind him, at mile marker 147, a woman in a white nightgown was standing in the snow with her bare feet and her white eyes, waiting for him to give up and accept what she had already accepted a long time ago. That on these frozen Montana highways, some storms never end, and some travelers never find their way home. Hollis kept his foot pressed hard on the accelerator, the engine roaring as his truck plowed through the deepening snow. His hands were locked on the wheel so tightly that his knuckles had gone white, and a thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead despite the cold that was seeping into every corner of the cab. The GPS display kept showing mile marker 152, the numbers frozen on the screen as if the satellite itself had stopped watching him, had turned away from whatever was happening on this stretch of Montana highway. The thing that terrified Hollis most wasn't the woman with the white eyes, or the impossible loop he seemed to be trapped in. It was the growing realization that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened on Highway 87. He'd heard stories over the years, fragments of conversations on CB radio at truck stops, whispered warnings from other drivers who ran the northern routes during winter. Stories about truckers who disappeared on this highway during storms, their rigs found days later abandoned on the shoulder with engines still running and heaters on full blast. But no trace of the drivers themselves. Stories about voices on the radio that knew things they shouldn't know, about mile markers that repeated themselves, about a woman in white who stood in the snow and waited for drivers who made the mistake of stopping to help. Hollis had always dismissed those stories as trucker folklore, the kind of campfire tales that got passed around to break up the monotony of long hauls. But now, trapped in his own impossible nightmare, he understood that the stories had been warnings. Other drivers had tried to tell him that this highway was wrong, that winter brought something out onto these roads that had nothing to do with weather or natural phenomena, and he'd ignored them. The way experienced drivers always ignored the superstitions of others, confident in his own knowledge and skill. The headlights caught something up ahead, and Hollis felt his stomach drop. It was his own truck, or what looked exactly like his own truck, parked on the shoulder with hazard lights flashing. He could see himself through the windshield, sitting behind the wheel with the same expression of confusion and fear that he knew was on his own face right now. As he drove closer, the other version of himself looked directly at him, made eye contact through the layers of falling snow, and mouthed a single word that Hollis could read clearly even at a distance: "Run." Then he was past the parked truck, and when he checked his mirrors, he saw nothing but empty highway behind him. The temperature gauge had dropped to 28 below zero, far colder than any truck's heating system was designed to handle. Frost was creeping across the inside of his windshield in intricate patterns that almost looked like writing, like someone was trying to spell out a message in ice crystals. Hollis scraped at the frost with his gloved hand, trying to clear enough space to see the road, but the patterns kept forming faster than he could clear them away. His CB radio, which he had torn from its mounting and thrown into the sleeper berth, suddenly crackled to life again. Hollis twisted in his seat and stared at the device lying among his blankets and spare clothing. The face was dark, no power lights visible, wires dangling uselessly from the back where he'd ripped it free from its connections. But the speaker was broadcasting clearly, and the voice coming through was male this time, rough and weathered like someone who'd spent decades breathing diesel fumes and road dust. "Northbound driver in the Freightliner. This is Highway Patrol. We're showing your transponder signal at mile marker 152, but you're not moving. What's your status?" Hollis grabbed for his own CB handset before remembering that it was no longer connected to anything. He reached for his cell phone instead, but the screen was completely dark, the battery drained despite having been fully charged when he started his drive. Every electronic device in his truck was either malfunctioning or dead. Every system that connected him to the outside world had been severed, and he was completely alone in the storm with whatever was hunting him. The disconnected CB radio continued to broadcast. "Driver, if you can hear this, we need you to respond. We're picking up some unusual readings from your location. Temperature anomalies, electromagnetic interference. We're dispatching a unit to your position, but with the road conditions, it's going to be at least 45 minutes before we can reach you. If you're in distress, try to stay with your vehicle. Hollis wanted to believe that the voice was real, that help was actually coming, but he knew better. Whatever was speaking through that dead radio wasn't the highway patrol. It was something that wanted him to stop, to sit and wait while it closed in around him like the cold itself. He pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing his speed up to 50 miles per hour despite the ice beneath his tires and the snow that was falling so thick it was like driving through a white curtain. The truck fishtailed slightly on a curve, the trailer swinging out behind him, and Hollis had to fight the wheel to keep everything under control. He'd been driving in winter conditions for 16 years and had never felt this level of fear, this bone-deep certainty that if he made even one small mistake, if he let his truck slide off the road, or if he stopped for even a moment, he would never leave this highway alive. Mile marker 147 appeared in his headlights, and Hollis felt his heart sink. He'd been driving north for over an hour since his first encounter with the abandoned pickup, should have covered at least 30 miles by now. But here he was back at the same location where this nightmare had started. The pickup truck was gone from the shoulder, no sign that it had ever been there, but the woman was standing in the middle of the road directly in his path. She was closer this time, close enough that Hollis could see her face clearly in his headlights. She was young, couldn't have been more than 30 when she died, with pale blonde hair that hung in frozen strands around her shoulders. Her white nightgown was stained with something dark around the hem, and her bare feet were planted firmly on the frozen pavement as if she couldn't feel the cold that would have killed a living person in minutes. But it was her eyes that held Hollis frozen, those terrible white orbs that seemed to look straight through him and see everything he was, everything he feared, everything he'd ever done that he was ashamed of. Hollis jerked the wheel to the left, trying to swerve around her, but she moved with him, always staying directly in his path no matter which direction he turned. He could see her lips moving, forming words that he couldn't hear over the roar of his engine and the howl of the wind, but he knew what she was saying. The same thing she'd been saying since this started. Stop. Stay with me. It's so cold out here. I've been alone for so long. The distance between his truck and the woman was closing rapidly. 20 feet, then 10, then 5, and Hollis made a decision that went against every instinct of self-preservation he possessed. He didn't brake, didn't swerve again, just kept his foot pressed down on the accelerator and aimed his truck directly at the figure standing in the road. If she was real, if she was somehow a living person despite everything he'd seen, then the impact would kill her. But Hollis knew with absolute certainty that she wasn't alive, that she was something else entirely, and that the only way to break whatever spell or curse or nightmare he'd fallen into was to drive straight through her. The truck hit the woman at 45 miles per hour, and Hollis braced himself for an impact that never came. There was no sound of collision, no feeling of striking anything solid, just a sudden blast of cold air so intense that it made his previous exposure to the Montana winter feel like a warm spring day by comparison. The cold swept through the cab like a living thing, freezing the moisture in Hollis's breath and coating the inside of the windshield with a layer of ice so thick that he was instantly driving blind. Hollis hit his brakes and the truck skidded wildly across the ice-covered highway, the trailer jackknifing behind him as the tires lost all traction. He spun the wheel frantically, trying to correct the skid, but the truck was completely out of control now, sliding sideways across both lanes of the highway. Time seemed to slow down as the truck rotated, and Hollis watched the world outside his windows blur into a chaos of white snow and dark sky. He was going to crash, going to roll his truck, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The truck came to a stop so suddenly that Hollis was thrown against his seatbelt hard enough to knock the wind out of his lungs. He sat there gasping for air, trying to understand what had just happened, and slowly realized that his truck was sitting perfectly straight on the highway, pointing north, engine still running smoothly. There was no damage that he could see, no sign of the violent skid that should have put him in the ditch or worse. It was as if the last 30 seconds had been erased, replaced with a version of reality where he'd never lost control at all. The ice on his windshield was melting rapidly now, running down the glass in rivulets of water that quickly refroze into new patterns. Through the clearing glass, Hollis could see that the snow had stopped falling. The wind had died down to nothing, and the clouds above were breaking apart to reveal a sky full of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. The temperature gauge on his dashboard was climbing steadily, rising from 28 below to 20 below, then to 15, then to 10. The storm was ending, or more accurately, it was being pulled back like a curtain to reveal what had been hiding behind it all along. Hollis put his truck in gear and started driving again, slowly this time, his eyes scanning the highway ahead for any sign of the woman or the impossible loop that had held him captive. The road looked normal now, just an empty stretch of Montana highway with snow-covered fields stretching away on both sides. Mile markers appeared at proper intervals as he drove. 148, 149, 150, each one confirmation that he was actually moving forward instead of being trapped in the same repeating section of road. His CB radio, still disconnected and powerless in the sleeper berth, spoke one more time. But this voice was different from the others, older and sadder, with a quality that made Hollis think of wind blowing through abandoned buildings. "You made it through, driver. Not many do, but you need to understand something important. What you experienced tonight wasn't random. Highway 87 remembers everyone who drives it, especially in winter, especially when the storms come. And May Ellery remembers all of us most of all." Hollis grabbed the disconnected radio and held it close, speaking to it even though his microphone was no longer attached. Who is May Ellery? What does she want? The voice on the radio seemed to sigh, a sound like wind whistling through power lines. She was a trucker's wife, back in the 70s. Her husband ran this route every week, hauling freight between Billings and Great Falls. One night in February, he was running late, driving too fast for conditions, trying to make up time. His truck went off the road at mile marker 147. May was with him that night, riding along to keep him company. They found the truck 3 days later, half buried in a snowdrift. The husband was already dead from the cold, but May lived for almost a week before the exposure finally took her. The voice paused, and Hollis heard what might have been static, or might have been the sound of someone crying. They say she went mad in those final days, hypothermia and delirium turning her mind inside out. She kept talking about how cold she was, how she was waiting for someone to help her, how every trucker who passed on the highway above could have stopped but didn't. By the time the search crews found her, she'd been dead for days, frozen solid in her nightgown in the cab of that truck. But some part of her never left this highway. Some part of her is still waiting at mile marker 147, still cold, still angry at everyone who drives past without stopping. Hollis felt something cold settle in his chest, a weight that had nothing to do with temperature. Why me? Why tonight? The voice on the radio was fading now, growing distant as if the speaker was walking away down a long corridor. "You stopped and looked, driver. You saw her truck and you slowed down. That's more attention than most people give her. It was enough to let her reach out, to pull you into her storm. You got lucky tonight. You drove through her when most drivers would have stopped or turned around. That broke her hold on you. But she'll remember you now, Hollis McCrae. She'll remember that you saw her and that you kept driving anyway. And the next time you run this route in winter, she'll be waiting." The radio went completely silent after that. No static, no voices, nothing at all. Hollis set it down gently in the passenger seat and focused on the road ahead. He was approaching the outskirts of Great Falls now, could see the glow of city lights on the horizon, the reassuring evidence of civilization and other people in places where impossible things didn't happen. His hands had finally stopped shaking, and the temperature in his cab had returned to normal, but he knew that something fundamental had changed tonight. A green highway sign appeared in his headlights. Great Falls, 15 miles. Hollis had never been so grateful to see city limits in his entire life. He checked his fuel gauge and saw that he had plenty of diesel to reach town, then checked his clock and discovered something that sent a fresh chill down his spine. According to the dashboard clock, it was 2:47 a.m., which meant only about 90 minutes had passed since he first saw the abandoned pickup at mile marker 147. But Hollis knew for certain that he'd been driving for much longer than that. Hours of endless highway and impossible loops and encounters with things that shouldn't exist. Time itself had been twisted by whatever had happened on that stretch of highway, compressed or stretched or folded in on itself in ways that Hollis's mind couldn't fully comprehend. He thought about calling his dispatcher when he got to town, reporting what had happened, but he knew how that conversation would go. They'd think he was having some kind of breakdown, maybe pull him off the road for mandatory psychological evaluation. Nobody would believe him, because what he'd experienced was so far outside the boundaries of normal reality that it might as well have happened on another planet. As Hollis drove into Great Falls, the streets were mostly empty at this hour, just a few cars and trucks moving through the intersections. Everything looked normal and solid and real, the brick buildings and traffic lights and convenience stores glowing in the darkness. Hollis pulled into the first truck stop he found, a familiar national chain location where he'd stopped dozens of times before. He parked in a space near the main building and sat in his cab for a long moment, his engine idling, trying to convince himself that the nightmare was really over. A Montana State Patrol car pulled into the lot and parked next to Hollis's truck. The officer who climbed out was tall and lean, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent years working outdoors in harsh conditions. He walked over to Hollis's door and knocked on the window, and Hollis rolled it down to see what the officer wanted. The trooper's name tag read Vernon Keats, and his expression was a mix of concern and something else that Hollis couldn't quite identify. Relief, maybe, or surprise. "You Hollis McCrae?" Keats asked, his breath forming clouds in the cold air. Hollis nodded, wondering how the officer knew his name. "We got a strange call about 2 hours ago from a dispatcher saying one of their drivers had gone missing on Highway 87. Said your transponder signal had frozen at mile marker 152 and they couldn't raise you on radio or cell phone. They were pretty worried about you." Keats studied Hollis's face carefully, as if looking for signs of injury or distress. "You have any trouble out there tonight?" Hollis considered lying, considered just saying that his radio had malfunctioned, and his phone had died and everything was fine. But something about the way Keats was looking at him suggested that the officer knew more than he was saying, that maybe he'd heard stories about Highway 87 in winter, about drivers who had encounters they couldn't explain. "I saw something out there," Hollis said quietly. "At mile marker 147, a woman standing in the snow. She tried to make me stop." Keats's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind his eyes. "May Ellery," he said, and it wasn't a question. "She shows up every few years during bad winter storms, usually targets truckers driving alone, tries to get them to stop and help her. We've had 3 drivers disappear on that stretch of highway over the past decade. Found their trucks abandoned with the engines running and the heaters on full blast, but the drivers were never located. We think they stopped to help her, got out of their vehicles, and—" He trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. "What is she?" Hollis asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Keats leaned against Hollis's truck, looking tired and old beyond his years. Depends on who you ask. Some people say she's a ghost, the spirit of a woman who froze to death and can't move on. Other people think she's something else, something that was drawn to this highway by all the deaths and accidents that have happened here over the years. Whatever she is, she's real enough to kill people, and she's been doing it for a long time. Keats reached into his jacket and pulled out a small card with a phone number printed on it. If you ever run this route again and you see her, don't stop. Don't slow down. Don't try to help. Just keep driving and call this number when you get to civilization. We've got a few people who specialize in this kind of thing, people who understand what's really happening on Highway 87 when the winter storms roll in. He handed the card to Hollis, who took it with fingers that had started shaking again. You did good tonight, Mr. McCrae. Most drivers who encounter May don't make it out. You're one of the lucky ones. Hollis looked down at the card in his hand, then back up at Keats. I don't feel lucky. I feel like I barely survived something that should have killed me. Keats nodded slowly. That's because you did barely survive. And now you know the truth about these roads, about what waits out there in the cold and the dark. Most people never learn that truth. They just disappear, and nobody ever finds out what really happened to them. Hollis sat in the truck stop diner nursing his third cup of coffee, watching the sun come up over Great Falls through windows that were fogged with condensation. The coffee was terrible, burnt and bitter, but he kept drinking it anyway because it was hot and real and helped ground him in the present moment. His hands had finally stopped shaking about an hour ago, but his mind kept replaying the events on Highway 87, examining them from every angle like a tongue probing a sore tooth. Trooper Keats had stayed with him for another 30 minutes after their initial conversation, asking careful questions about exactly what Hollis had seen and experienced. The officer had taken notes in a small leather-bound notebook, writing down details about the mile markers, the temperature readings, the radio malfunctions, and May Ellery's appearance. Keats had seemed unsurprised by everything Hollis told him, nodding along as if he'd heard similar stories many times before. Before he left, Keats had given Hollis one final warning. Don't talk about this with other drivers. Most of them won't believe you, and the ones who do will think you're cursed. Either way, it'll make your life harder. But Hollis couldn't stop thinking about what Keats had said regarding the 3 drivers who'd disappeared over the past decade. 3 men who'd encountered May Ellery and had made different choices than Hollis had made, who'd stopped their trucks and gotten out to help what they thought was a stranded motorist. 3 families who were still waiting for answers about what had happened to their husbands and fathers and brothers. Hollis wondered if he should feel grateful that he'd survived, or guilty that his instinct for self-preservation had been stronger than his desire to help someone in need. The diner was starting to fill up with morning customers, mostly truckers who were grabbing breakfast before hitting the road. Hollis recognized a few faces from previous trips through Great Falls, nodded to a couple of drivers he'd shared loading docks with over the years. Nobody seemed to notice anything unusual about him, couldn't see the way his hand still trembled slightly when he lifted his coffee cup, couldn't sense the fundamental change that had occurred in how he understood the world and what was possible within it. A heavy-set driver with a gray beard sat down across from Hollis without asking permission, setting his own coffee and a plate of eggs and bacon on the table. The man's name was stitched on his jacket, Dale. He studied Hollis for a moment with eyes that had seen too many miles of highway, then spoke in a low voice that wouldn't carry to the other tables. You ran 87 last night, didn't you, during the storm? It wasn't really a question, more of a statement of fact. Hollis considered denying it, but something about Dale's expression told him that lying would be pointless. How did you know? Dale took a bite of his eggs and chewed slowly before answering. You've got the look. Same look I've seen on maybe a dozen drivers over the years who came through that route during winter. Like you've seen something that you can't unsee, something that changed the way you think about being alone on the road. He paused, took a sip of coffee. You saw her, didn't you? The woman in white. Hollis felt a chill run down his spine despite the warmth of the diner. You know about May Ellery? Again, not a question. Dale nodded slowly. Everyone who's been driving the northern routes for more than a few years knows about her, even if they don't talk about it openly. She's been haunting Highway 87 since the mid-70s, showing up during winter storms, trying to lure drivers into stopping. Most of us have learned to just keep driving when we see her, pretend we didn't notice anything unusual. But every few years, someone new comes through who doesn't know the stories and they stop to help because that's what decent people do when they see someone in trouble. Dale's expression grew darker. I lost a friend to her back in 2009. Good man named Marcus, been driving for 20 years, had a wife and 3 kids waiting for him at home. He called me on his CB that night. Said he'd stopped to help a woman who was stranded in the snow. Said she looked like she was freezing to death and he couldn't just drive past. That was the last time anyone heard from him. State Patrol found his truck the next morning, engine running, heater on full blast. But Marcus was gone. Never found a body, never found any sign of what happened to him. Hollis listened in silence as Dale continued. The thing about May Ellery is that she doesn't just kill people. She takes them somewhere, removes them from existence like they were never there at all. The missing drivers, their families, can't even get closure because there's no body to bury, no official cause of death, nothing except an empty truck and a lot of unanswered questions. The insurance companies call them voluntary abandonments, claim the drivers just walked away from their lives. But we know better. The weight of Dale's words settled over Hollis like a heavy blanket. He thought about his own wife waiting for him at home, the daughter in college who called him every Sunday night to check in, the life he'd built over 16 years of reliable long-haul driving. All of it could have been erased last night if he'd made a different choice, if he'd been more compassionate or less cautious, or just slightly slower to react. Why doesn't someone do something about her? Hollis asked. Why don't they close that section of highway during winter storms, or at least put up warning signs? Dale laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Who would they warn, and what would the signs say? Beware of ghost trucker's wife who freezes people to death. The state can't officially acknowledge that something supernatural is happening on Highway 87 because that would open them up to liability for every accident and disappearance that's ever occurred there. So they pretend it's just a dangerous stretch of road with bad weather conditions, and they tell drivers to use caution during winter storms. And most of us do use caution. We drive fast. We don't stop for anything, and we pray that we don't see a woman in a white nightgown standing in the siew. Hollis pulled out the card that Trooper Keats had given him and showed it to Dale. Keats said there are people who specialize in this kind of thing, people who understand what's really happening. Dale glanced at the card and nodded. There's a small group of state patrol officers and federal investigators who track paranormal activity on the highway system. They don't talk about it publicly, can't talk about it officially, but they keep records, and they try to help drivers who've had encounters. Keats is one of the good ones. He actually believes the stories and tries to do something about them, even though his hands are mostly tied by bureaucracy and public skepticism. The conversation was interrupted by a waitress coming to refill their coffee. Both men sat in silence until she moved away. Then Dale leaned forward and spoke even more quietly than before. I'm going to tell you something that most drivers don't know, something that Keats probably didn't mention because it sounds too crazy, even by the standards of what we're talking about. May Ellery isn't the only one out there. Highway 87 is bad, but there are other routes across the northern states that have their own ghosts and monsters. Interstate 90 through the Dakotas has something that pretends to be stranded motorists but isn't human. Route 2 across Minnesota has disappearing exits that lead to places that shouldn't exist. Route 89 through Wyoming has stretches where time doesn't flow normally. Dale pulled a worn notebook from his jacket pocket and flipped through pages covered with handwritten notes and sketches. I've been documenting this stuff for 15 years, collecting stories from other drivers, mapping out the dangerous sections of highway. Started doing it after Marcus disappeared. Thought maybe if I could understand what was happening, I could prevent other people from suffering the same fate. What I've learned is that the entire northern highway system is compromised somehow, infected with supernatural phenomena that prey on travelers. It's like there's something about these cold, isolated roads that attracts or creates things that shouldn't exist. Hollis looked at the notebook pages, saw references to dozens of different encounters and locations, names and dates and descriptions of impossible events. Why are you showing me this? Dale closed the notebook and met Hollis's eyes. Because you survived an encounter with May Ellery, which means you're either very lucky or very strong-willed or both. And I think maybe you're the kind of person who could help with what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to create a warning system, a way for drivers to share information about supernatural activity on specific routes so we can avoid the dangerous areas during high-risk times. The idea appealed to Hollis on some level, the thought that he could turn his terrifying experience into something useful that might save other drivers from similar fates. But another part of him just wanted to forget everything that had happened last night, wanted to go back to believing that the world was a rational place where ghosts and time loops and frozen women with white eyes didn't exist. I need to think about it, Hollis said finally. I need to process what happened before I can think about getting more involved in this. Dale nodded and stood up from the table, leaving a $20 bill to cover both their meals. Fair enough. But if you change your mind, there's a trucker forum online where some of us share information. It's private, invitation only, but I can get you access if you want it. Just remember that what you experienced last night wasn't random, and it wasn't unique. Dozens of drivers go through similar things every winter, and most of them suffer in silence because they're afraid of being labeled as crazy. Maybe you can help change that. After Dale left, Hollis sat alone in the diner for another hour, watching the morning traffic build on the streets outside. He thought about calling his wife, but decided against it because he didn't know what he would tell her. The truth would sound insane, but lying felt wrong after everything he'd been through. Finally, he paid his bill and walked back to his truck, intending to catch a few hours of sleep in the sleeper berth before continuing his route. His truck looked exactly as he'd left it, just another big rig in a parking lot full of commercial vehicles. But when Hollis climbed into the cab, he found something that made his blood run cold. Sitting on his driver's seat was the disconnected CB radio that he'd torn from its mounting and thrown into the sleeper berth during his encounter with May Ellery. The radio was sitting upright, perfectly centered on the seat, placed there deliberately by someone or something that had been inside his locked truck. Hollis picked up the radio with hands that had started shaking again. The device was ice cold to the touch, much colder than it should have been even sitting in an unheated cab overnight. Frost covered the speaker grill in intricate patterns that looked almost like writing, and when Hollis tilted the radio to catch the light, he could make out what the frost patterns spelled. "See you again soon, Hollis." He threw the radio into the parking lot as hard as he could, watched it shatter into pieces on the frozen asphalt. But even as he did it, Hollis knew that destroying the physical device wouldn't change anything. May Ellery had marked him somehow, had left her fingerprints on his soul, and he would carry that mark for the rest of his life. Every time he drove through Montana in winter, Every time he passed mile marker 147, he would remember the woman in the white nightgown standing in the snow with her terrible white eyes and her voice that spoke directly into his mind. Hollis started his engine and pulled out of the truck stop parking lot, heading west toward his delivery destination in Missoula. The morning was clear and cold, with no sign of the storm that had nearly killed him just a few hours earlier. Other trucks were moving on the highway, normal traffic flowing in normal patterns, and for a moment Hollis could almost convince himself that everything was going to be fine. But then his heater began blowing cold air despite being set to maximum heat, and his radio turned itself on even though he hadn't touched the controls, and he knew that May Ellery wasn't finished with him yet. The radio cycled through stations randomly just like it had done during his encounter on Highway 87. Country music, talk radio, weather reports, all bleeding together in a cacophony of sound that shouldn't have been possible from a standard truck radio. Then all the stations went silent at once, replaced by the sound of wind howling across frozen plains. And beneath the wind, barely audible but definitely there, was a woman's voice singing something that might have been a lullaby or might have been a funeral dirge. Hollis reached for the radio controls to turn it off, but before his fingers touched the dial, the voice spoke directly to him. "You think you escaped, Hollis. You think driving away means you're safe. But you carry me with you now. Every mile you drive, every highway you travel, I'll be there in the static and the cold. You belong to the winter roads now, just like I do. And when your time comes, when the storms find you alone and far from help, I'll be waiting to welcome you home." The radio went dead after that, completely silent no matter how Hollis adjusted the controls. He drove for another 20 minutes in that oppressive silence, his mind racing through everything that had happened and everything that Dale had told him. Finally, he pulled over at a rest area and used his cell phone to call his dispatcher. When the call connected, Hollis said the words that he never thought he'd say. "I need to be taken off the Montana routes, permanently. I don't care if it costs me money or seniority. I'm not driving Highway 87 again." His dispatcher asked questions, wanted explanations, but Hollis just repeated his request until the man agreed to reassign his northern routes to other drivers. It would mean less work and lower pay, would probably damage his reputation in the company, but Hollis didn't care. Survival was more important than pride or money. He'd been given a warning last night, a chance to escape that 3 other drivers hadn't received, and he wasn't going to waste that gift by pretending he could just go back to business as usual. As Hollis ended the call and prepared to get back on the road, his phone rang with a call from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. The voice on the other end was Trooper Keats. "Mr. McCrae, I heard you requested a route change. That's probably smart, all things considered. But I wanted to let you know that we found something this morning that you should be aware of. We went back to mile marker 147 after sunrise to document the location where you had your encounter. We found a pickup truck buried in a snowdrift about 50 yards from the road. It's been there since 1974, according to the registration. Belongs to a man named Harold Ellery." Hollis felt his stomach drop. May's husband. Keats' voice was grim. "That's right. We always knew the truck was out there somewhere, but the snow had buried it so deep we could never locate it. The storm last night must have shifted the drifts around, exposed part of the vehicle. We're sending a recovery team to excavate it, see if we can finally bring some closure to this case." There was a long pause before Keats continued. "The thing is, Mr. McCrae, we found something else. There were tracks in the snow leading from the buried truck to the highway. Barefoot tracks, human-sized, made sometime during last night's storm. They led right to the spot where you said you encountered May Ellery." Hollis closed his eyes and leaned his head against the steering wheel. So she's still out there, still waiting. Keats's response was quiet but firm. She's always been out there, Mr. McCrae, and based on what we found this morning, I don't think she's ever going to leave. That stretch of Highway 87 belongs to her now, has belonged to her for 50 years. The only thing we can do is warn people and hope they listen. You did the right thing by requesting a route change. Most drivers don't get a second chance after encountering May Ellery. After Keats hung up, Hollis sat in his truck for a long time, watching the morning sun climb higher in the clear winter sky. He thought about May Ellery, frozen in her nightgown beside her husband's truck for a week before death finally took her. Thought about the terror and rage and loneliness she must have felt, watching trucks pass on the highway above while she slowly died from exposure. Thought about how that experience had twisted her into something that now inflicted the same fate on others, trapping them in her storm, feeding on their fear. And Hollis understood, finally, that he hadn't really escaped at all. May Ellery had let him go, had released him from her storm, but only so he could carry her story forward. Every time he talked about what had happened, every time he warned another driver about Highway 87, he was extending her reach, giving her power over people who had never even seen her. She didn't need to kill him to claim him. She just needed him to remember, and to make sure that others remembered too. Hollis started his engine and pulled back onto the highway, heading west toward Missoula and the rest of his life. But he knew that no matter how many miles he put between himself and mile marker 147, no matter how many years passed before he died, a part of him would always be standing in that storm, facing a woman in a white nightgown with eyes like winter itself, listening to her voice on the wind asking why he wouldn't stop, why he wouldn't help, why he insisted on leaving her alone in the cold. 3 weeks passed before Hollis accepted another long-haul contract, and even then he made sure the route kept him well south of Montana. He'd been running loads through Nevada and Utah, familiar highways where the winter was cold, but not the kind of cold that settled into your bones and refused to leave. His dispatcher had honored the route change request without too many questions, though Hollis knew there was talk among the other drivers about why someone with his seniority and reliability would suddenly refuse the high-paying northern runs. The nightmares had started on the second night after his encounter with May Ellery. Always the same dream, or maybe it wasn't a dream at all, but a memory that kept replaying itself every time Hollis closed his eyes. He was back on Highway 87 in the storm, driving through snow so thick he couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and May was standing in the road with her white eyes and her terrible patience. But in the dreams, Hollis always made a different choice. He stopped the truck, climbed down from the cab, walked toward her through the freezing wind, and just as he reached her, just as her cold fingers touched his face, he would wake up gasping and covered in sweat despite the temperature in his sleeper berth. His wife had noticed the change in him, asked careful questions about whether everything was okay on the road. Hollis had tried to explain what happened, had actually sat her down one evening and told her the whole story from beginning to end. She'd listened patiently, held his hand while he talked, but he could see the concern in her eyes. Not concern about supernatural truckers' wives haunting Montana highways, but concern about her husband's mental state, about whether the stress of long-haul driving had finally broken something important inside him. She'd suggested he take some time off, maybe see a doctor, get some help processing whatever trauma he'd experienced. Hollis had tried to let it go, had tried to convince himself that what happened on Highway 87 was a one-time encounter that wouldn't follow him to other roads. But he kept finding reminders that May Ellery wasn't finished with him. Small things at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. His truck's heater would suddenly start blowing cold air for no mechanical reason. His CB radio would pick up fragments of a woman's voice singing even when no one was broadcasting. The temperature gauge would occasionally spike down to impossible readings, showing 30 or 40 degrees below zero even when he was driving through desert heat. Other truckers had started avoiding him at truck stops and loading docks. Word had spread somehow about his encounter on Highway 87, about his sudden refusal to run northern routes, and the community had drawn its own conclusions. Some drivers thought he'd cracked under pressure, that he'd had some kind of breakdown that made him unreliable. Others thought he was cursed, that he'd brought something back from that frozen highway that might spread to anyone who got too close to him. Either way, the easy camaraderie that Hollis had always enjoyed with his fellow drivers had evaporated, replaced by polite distance and careful avoidance. Dale had reached out twice, once by email and once by phone, inviting Hollis to join the private trucker forum where drivers shared information about supernatural encounters on the highway system. Hollis had declined both times, not ready to fully accept that what he'd experienced was part of a larger pattern, not ready to become someone who spent his time documenting impossible events instead of just driving trucks and earning a living. But Dale's words kept echoing in his mind, the suggestion that dozens of drivers went through similar experiences every winter and suffered in silence because they were afraid of being labeled as crazy. It was late March when Hollis took a contract that required him to drive through southern Montana, not Highway 87, but Interstate 90, a major route that cut across the bottom of the state. The pay was good enough that Hollis couldn't afford to refuse it, and the route was more than 100 miles south of where he'd encountered May Ellery. He told himself it would be fine, that Montana was a big state, and whatever haunted Highway 87 wouldn't have any influence on a completely different road. But as soon as he crossed the state line, Hollis felt the temperature in his cab drop despite his heater running normally, and he knew that distance didn't matter as much as he'd hoped. The drive through southern Montana should have taken about 6 hours, an easy day's work on a well-maintained interstate. But Hollis found himself constantly checking his mirrors, watching for hazard lights flashing on abandoned vehicles, scanning the roadside for figures standing in places where no one should be. The paranoia was exhausting, made worse by the fact that nothing unusual actually happened. The highway remained clear, the weather stayed cold but manageable, and the only other vehicles Hollis encountered were normal trucks and cars driven by normal people going about their normal business. He stopped for fuel at a truck stop outside Billings, the same city where he'd started his fateful journey on Highway 87 3 weeks earlier. The truck stop was busy with afternoon traffic, drivers grabbing food and coffee before continuing their routes. Hollis was standing in line at the register when he noticed a bulletin board near the entrance, covered with the usual mixture of job postings, lost pet flyers, and advertisements for truck parts and services. But one flyer caught his attention, a simple white sheet of paper with a black and white photograph and text printed in block letters. The photograph showed a man in his mid-40s wearing a trucker's cap and standing in front of a Peterbilt. The text beneath the photo read, "Missing, Raymond Vickers, age 47, last seen February 28th on Highway 87 north of Great Falls. Vehicle found abandoned at mile marker 147, no sign of driver. Family seeking any information about his whereabouts. Please call with any tips." There was a phone number at the bottom of the flyer and a plea from his wife to help bring him home. Hollis stared at the flyer for a long time, his hands starting to shake. February 28th was exactly 5 days after his own encounter with May Ellery. Raymond Vickers had driven through that same stretch of highway during another winter storm, had encountered the same woman in the white nightgown, and had made a different choice than Hollis had made. He'd stopped to help, just like May wanted, and now his family was posting flyers and waiting for answers that would never come. Hollis pulled out his phone and called the number that Trooper Keats had given him. The officer answered on the third ring, and Hollis could hear wind and road noise in the background, suggesting that Keats was out on patrol. "Mr. McCrae, I wasn't expecting to hear from you again." There was something in Keats's tone that suggested he knew exactly why Hollis was calling. "You saw the flyer about Raymond Vickers. He encountered her, didn't he? 5 days after I did. Mile marker 147, same location." Hollis's voice was tight with emotion he couldn't quite identify. Guilt, maybe, or anger, or just exhaustion at carrying the weight of knowledge he couldn't share with anyone who would understand. Keats sighed heavily. "We found his truck on March 1st, 3 days after he was reported missing. Engine running, heater on full blast, cab completely empty. Same pattern we've seen with the other disappearances. We searched the area for 2 weeks but never found any trace of him. It's like he just vanished into thin air." "Why didn't you close the highway?" Hollis demanded. "Why didn't you at least put up warning signs after what happened to me? You knew she was still active, knew she was going to keep taking people." Keats's response was carefully measured, the voice of someone who'd had this same argument with himself many times. "I filed reports, Mr. McCrae. I documented everything you told me, and I recommended that the state implement additional safety measures for that section of highway during winter weather. But my superiors made it clear that we can't officially acknowledge supernatural causes for traffic incidents. The best we can do is increase patrol presence and recommend that drivers use extreme caution during storms. That's not good enough," Hollis said, though he knew that Keats agreed with him. Raymond Vickers had a family. They deserved to know what really happened to him. Keats was silent for a moment before responding. "Do they, though? Would it really help his wife and children to know that he was taken by the ghost of a woman who froze to death in 1974? Would that give them closure? Or would it just add another layer of nightmare to their grief? Sometimes the truth causes more harm than uncertainty." Hollis ended the call and stood in the truck stop parking lot for a long time, watching other drivers come and go about their business. Normal people doing normal jobs, unaware of the dangers that waited on certain stretches of highway when conditions were right. Or maybe they weren't unaware. Maybe they just chose not to acknowledge what they saw, chose to keep driving and not ask too many questions because the truth was too frightening to face directly. The private trucker forum that Dale had mentioned was called The Long Haul Truth, and it took Hollis less than 30 minutes to find it online and request access. Dale approved his membership within an hour, and suddenly Hollis was looking at hundreds of posts from drivers across the country sharing stories about encounters they couldn't explain. Not just May Ellery on Highway 87, but dozens of other phenomena on other roads. Phantom hitchhikers on Route 2 through Minnesota. Time loops on Interstate 80 through Wyoming. Disappearing truck stops that existed one night and were gone the next morning. Missing drivers whose trucks were found abandoned with no logical explanation for what had happened. Hollis spent 3 hours reading through the posts, following threads that went back years, seeing patterns emerge that suggested something fundamental was wrong with the American highway system. The encounters weren't random or isolated. They were concentrated along specific routes during specific times of year, as if certain roads had been infected with something that preyed on travelers. And the trucking industry, with its culture of independence and its tendency to dismiss uncomfortable truths, was the perfect environment for these phenomena to thrive unnoticed by the wider world. One thread, in particular, caught Hollis's attention, a discussion about whether drivers who survived encounters with highway phenomena became carriers of some kind, whether they brought the supernatural home with them in ways that affected their future travels. Several drivers reported experiencing ongoing manifestations months or years after their initial encounters, small reminders that they'd been marked by something that wouldn't let them forget. Sudden temperature drops in their cabs. Voices on their radios speaking languages that shouldn't exist. The feeling of being watched by something that existed just outside their peripheral vision. Hollis added his own story to the forum, typing out everything that had happened on Highway 87 in as much detail as he could remember. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of drivers reaching out to share similar experiences or offer advice on how to cope with the aftermath of supernatural encounters. Several drivers confirmed that May Ellery was still active, that she'd been taking truckers for decades and would continue taking them until someone found a way to stop her permanently. Others warned Hollis that surviving one encounter didn't guarantee safety from future incidents, that he'd been marked in ways he didn't fully understand yet. That night, parked at a rest area in Wyoming, Hollis had the dream again. But this time it was different. This time, when he walked toward May Ellery through the storm and her cold fingers touched his face, he didn't wake up. Instead, he found himself standing beside her in the snow, both of them watching his truck drive away without him. And May spoke in a voice that was surprisingly gentle, almost sad. "You think you escaped me, Hollis. You think surviving one night means you're free. But we're bound now, you and I. Every time you drive alone in winter, every time you see snow falling on empty highway, you'll remember me. And eventually, whether it's next year or in 10 years, or on your very last drive, you'll come back to mile marker 147. They all come back eventually." Hollis woke up with frost covering the inside of his windshield despite his heater running all night. And he knew that May was right. He could change his routes, could avoid Montana entirely, could even quit trucking and find a different career. But he would never really escape Highway 87 because the experience had fundamentally changed how he understood the world and his place in it. He'd seen behind the curtain of normal reality and glimpsed the things that waited in the spaces between, and that knowledge would follow him wherever he went. Over the following months, Hollis became an active member of the Long Haul Truth Forum, sharing his experiences and learning from other drivers who'd survived encounters with highway phenomena. He started carrying additional equipment in his truck, not just the normal safety gear, but items that other drivers swore helped protect against supernatural incidents. Salt in sealed containers, iron nails in his pockets, recording equipment to document anything unusual that happened. None of it made him feel truly safe, but it gave him the illusion of control in a situation where control was mostly an illusion. The encounters continued, small incidents that never reached the intensity of his first night with May Ellery, but that reminded him constantly of her presence. His CB radio would occasionally broadcast her voice, singing songs from the 1970s in a tone that was both melancholy and threatening. His temperature gauge would spike to impossible readings whenever he drove through winter weather, regardless of what state he was in. And sometimes, late at night when he was alone on empty highways, he would see her in his mirrors, standing on the shoulder far behind him, watching him drive away. Hollis started documenting everything, keeping detailed logs of every unusual incident, every temperature anomaly, every radio malfunction. He sent his reports to Trooper Keats, who added them to what was apparently a growing file of supernatural highway incidents that would never be officially acknowledged, but that someone was quietly tracking. Keats told him that Raymond Vickers' body had never been found, that his family had held a memorial service without remains to bury, and that his wife still called the state patrol every few weeks hoping for new information. 2 more drivers disappeared on Highway 87 that year, both during winter storms, both at or near mile marker 147. The pattern was clear to anyone who bothered to look, but no one in authority was willing to connect the dots publicly. The official explanation was always the same: experienced drivers who inexplicably abandoned their vehicles during severe weather, victims of hypothermia or disorientation or personal crises that led them to walk away from their trucks and die in the wilderness. The families grieved without answers, and the trucking companies quietly assigned new drivers to the routes, and the highway system continued to function as if nothing unusual was happening. It was December, 10 months after his encounter with May Ellery, when Hollis received a message through the forum from Dale. The older driver had been diagnosed with late-stage cancer and was retiring from the road. He wanted to meet with Hollis in person, said there were things he needed to pass along before he could no longer drive. They agreed to meet at a truck stop in South Dakota, neutral territory far from any of the hot spots that both men had learned to avoid. Dale looked older than he had in February, the disease already taking its toll on his body. But his eyes were still sharp, still carrying that quality of having seen too much of the world's hidden darkness. He handed Hollis a worn leather journal, its pages filled with decades of handwritten notes about supernatural highway encounters. "I've been tracking this stuff for 30 years, Dale said quietly. "Started right after my first encounter with something that shouldn't exist. Kept going because I thought maybe I could find patterns, figure out how to protect people. I want you to have this. Keep adding to it. Maybe someday someone will figure out what to do with all this information." Hollis accepted the journal with hands that had long since stopped shaking from his encounter with May Ellery. The trembling had been replaced with something else, a kind of constant low-level anxiety that never quite went away, the awareness that he was moving through a world that was far stranger and more dangerous than most people realized. "Why me?" he asked Dale. "Why give this to me specifically?" Dale smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Because you survived when you should have died, and because you didn't let that survival make you complacent. You're still asking questions, still trying to understand what happened. That's rare. Most drivers who encounter May Ellery either die or spend the rest of their lives pretending it never happened. You're doing something different. You're bearing witness. Someone needs to do that." They talked for 3 hours, comparing notes and experiences, filling in gaps in each other's knowledge. Dale shared stories from the journal, cases going back to the 1980s, involving dozens of different supernatural phenomena on highways across the northern states. Hollis shared his ongoing experiences with May Ellery's presence following him from road to road. By the time they parted ways, Hollis understood that he'd inherited more than just a journal. He'd inherited a responsibility to document the truth about the highways, to warn other drivers when he could, to remember the people who'd disappeared and to so honor their memory by refusing to let their stories be forgotten. That night, alone in his truck at a rest area in Nebraska, Hollis added his own entry to Dale's journal. He wrote about Raymond Vickers and the other drivers who'd disappeared on Highway 87 that year. He wrote about the feeling of being followed by something that couldn't be escaped through distance or time. He wrote about the guilt of survival and the burden of knowledge that couldn't be shared with anyone who would believe it. And he wrote about May Ellery, standing forever in the snow at mile marker 147, waiting with infinite patience for the next driver who would make the mistake of stopping to help. Hollis continued driving after that, taking contracts across the western states, carefully avoiding Montana but knowing that avoidance was only a temporary solution. The highway system was vast and interconnected, and May Ellery's influence seemed to spread a little further each year, reaching into adjacent states, touching roads that had previously been safe. Other drivers reported seeing her on routes far from Highway 87, as if the cold itself was carrying her presence to new territories. The journal grew thicker with entries as Hollis documented his own experiences and collected stories from other drivers through the forum. Each page represented someone's encounter with the impossible, someone's narrow escape or tragic disappearance. The weight of all those stories became a physical thing that Hollis carried with him, a reminder that he wasn't alone in his knowledge, but also a burden that grew heavier with each passing month. Sometimes, late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Hollis would turn on his CB radio and scan through the channels. Most nights he heard only the normal chatter of truckers coordinating loads and sharing traffic information. But occasionally, maybe once a month or so, he would catch fragments of other voices. Drivers speaking from places that didn't exist anymore, broadcasting from times that had already passed, calling out warnings about dangers that were just beginning to manifest. And sometimes, though Hollis tried not to listen, he would hear May Ellery singing her sad songs from the frozen highway where she waited. Hollis never drove Highway 87 again, never returned to mile marker 147, never tested whether May Ellery's patience would finally run out. But he knew, with the certainty that came from 10 months of ongoing encounters, that eventually the highway would call him back. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday, when the conditions were right and the winter was cold enough and the storm was strong enough. Someday he would find himself on that frozen Montana road again, watching hazard lights blink in the distance, hearing a woman's voice on the radio asking why he wouldn't stop to help. And when that day came, Hollis didn't know what choice he would make. Whether he would keep driving like he had the first time, or whether May Ellery's persistent presence in his life would finally wear down his resistance and convince him to stop, to step out into the cold, to accept what she'd been offering since the beginning. The terrible certainty that eventually everyone who encountered her would have to make that choice again, and again, and again. Until finally, exhausted by the constant vigilance and the weight of knowledge and the loneliness of being marked by something that normal people couldn't see or understand, they would stop running. The highway was patient. The cold was eternal. And May Ellery would be waiting at mile marker 147, standing in her white nightgown with her terrible eyes and her voice that promised an end to fear, an end to uncertainty, an end to the exhausting work of staying alive on roads that belonged to the dead. She would be waiting, the way she'd been waiting for 50 years, the way she would wait for 50 more, patient and eternal as winter itself, claiming one driver at a time, building her collection of those who stopped to help and never left. Hollis drove on through the December darkness, his heater blowing cold air despite being set to maximum, his radio cycling through stations on its own, the frost forming on his windshield in patterns that almost looked like writing. Somewhere far to the north, snow was falling on Highway 87, covering the road in layers of white that would last until spring. And in that snow, beside a mile marker that most drivers had learned to pass without slowing down, a woman stood watching the darkness and waiting for the next set of headlights to appear through the storm. The oil boom had transformed North Dakota from empty prairie into a maze of industrial roads that carried everything from drilling equipment to housing modules for the workers who'd flooded into the state chasing high-paying jobs. Rowan Dillinger had been hauling freight on these roads for 7 years, ever since the fracking industry had exploded and created opportunities for drivers who didn't mind working in some of the most isolated and unforgiving territory in the lower 48 states. The pay was exceptional, almost double what Rowan could make on more conventional routes. But the work came with costs that weren't immediately obvious to drivers who were new to the oil patch. The roads themselves were the first problem. Most of them had been built quickly and cheaply to accommodate the sudden influx of industrial traffic, gravel, and dirt tracks that turned into mud pits during spring thaw and froze into bone-jarring washboards during winter. Rowan's truck took a constant beating on these roads, requiring maintenance far more frequently than it would have on normal highways. But the bigger problem was the isolation. The way these oil roads stretched for dozens of miles through empty prairie with no services, no cell phone coverage, and no help available if something went wrong. It was early January when Rowan accepted a contract to haul a load of drilling pipe from Williston to a remote drilling site about 90 miles northeast of town. The route would take him through some of the most desolate territory in the oil patch, following county roads that barely qualified as roads at all. The temperature was hovering around 5 degrees above zero, cold but manageable for a driver with experience in winter conditions. The forecast called for clear weather, and Rowan's truck had been serviced just 3 days earlier, so there was no reason to expect any problems with the delivery. Rowan left Williston just after dawn, watching the sun come up over frozen fields that stretched to the horizon in every direction. The landscape out here was almost featureless, just flat prairie broken occasionally by pump jacks nodding rhythmically as they pulled oil from deep underground. The roads were decent for the first 30 miles, maintained gravel surfaces that had been graded recently enough to provide relatively smooth travel. But as Rowan turned onto County Road 39, heading deeper into the oil patch, the surface deteriorated rapidly. The road became a narrow track of frozen dirt rutted by the passage of countless heavy trucks, with snowdrifts building up on both sides that made it impossible to see more than a few hundred yards ahead. Rowan kept his speed down to about 30 miles per hour, both hands on the wheel, feeling every bump and pothole transmitted through the truck's suspension. This was the kind of driving that wore on you after a while. The constant vigilance required to avoid the worst of the road damage. The knowledge that if you broke down out here, you might be waiting hours or even days for help to arrive. Rowan's truck was a 10-year-old Kenworth that he'd bought used and maintained meticulously, knowing that his livelihood depended on mechanical reliability. He'd replaced the engine 2 years ago, upgraded the electrical system, and kept detailed maintenance logs that documented every oil change and repair. The truck had never given him serious problems, had never left him stranded on these remote oil roads where being stranded could be genuinely dangerous. So, when the engine started running rough around mile marker 43, Rowan's first reaction was confusion rather than concern. The roughness was subtle at first, just a slight irregularity in the engine's rhythm that Rowan felt more than heard. He checked his gauges and saw that everything appeared normal, temperature and oil pressure both right where they should be. But the irregular running continued and gradually got worse, the engine beginning to misfire in a way that suggested fuel delivery problems. Rowan's stomach sank as he realized that he was going to have to stop and investigate, that continuing to drive with the engine misfiring could cause serious damage that would leave him completely immobilized. There was a wide spot in the road about a mile ahead, a place where oil company trucks sometimes parked while crews worked at nearby well sites. Rowan coaxed his truck forward, the engine coughing and sputtering now, barely maintaining enough power to keep moving. He managed to reach the wide spot and pulled off the main track, setting his parking brake and letting the engine idle while he tried to diagnose the problem. The engine continued its irregular rhythm, running for a few seconds, then nearly dying before catching again, like it was gasping for fuel that wasn't quite reaching the cylinders. Rowan grabbed his heavy parka and gloves and climbed down from the cab, immediately feeling the brutal cold that his truck's heater had been protecting him from. The wind was picking up, blowing across the open prairie with nothing to slow it down, and the temperature felt much colder than the 5 degrees his dashboard gauge had shown. Rowan walked around to the front of the truck and popped the hood, looking for obvious problems like loose connections or damaged hoses, but everything appeared normal. He spent 20 minutes checking various components, his fingers growing numb despite his insulated gloves, but couldn't identify any clear cause for the engine problems. The fuel filters looked clean, the electrical connections were secure, and there were no visible leaks or damage to any of the systems. It was as if the truck had simply decided to stop working properly for reasons that defied mechanical logic. Rowan climbed back into the cab and tried his cell phone, hoping to call for a mechanic, but there was no signal this far out in the oil patch. His CB radio was his only remaining option for communication, so Rowan keyed the microphone and broadcast on Channel 19. "This is Rowan Dillinger, broke down on County Road 39 about 43 miles northeast of Williston. Engine running rough, possible fuel delivery issue. Anyone in the area who can assist or relay a message to a repair service? He released the key and listened to static for several seconds before trying again with the same message. No response came back, which wasn't surprising given how remote this location was and how few other drivers would be working this area during winter. Rowan sat in his idling truck, trying to decide on his next move. He could wait here and hope that another driver would come along and could relay a message for help, but traffic on this road was sparse enough that he might be waiting for hours. He could try to continue driving despite the engine problems, but that risked causing damage that would leave him completely stranded. Or he could start walking back toward Williston, but that would mean abandoning his truck and cargo and hiking over 40 miles in sub-zero temperatures. None of the options were good, but sitting still and waiting felt like the least bad choice. Rowan had emergency supplies in his sleeper berth, enough food and water for several days, and his fuel tank was 3/4 full, which meant he could keep the engine running for heat. He settled in to wait, monitoring his CB radio for any traffic, and hoping that someone would pass by before too long. It was around 10 in the morning when Rowan first noticed the sign. He'd been parked for almost an hour, sitting in his cab reading a paperback novel to pass the time when movement in his peripheral vision made him look up. About a 1/4 mile down the road, in the direction he'd been traveling, there was a sign that Rowan was certain hadn't been there when he'd stopped. The sign was old and weathered, the kind of roadside advertising that dated back decades, and it was swaying slightly in the wind. Rowan couldn't read the text from this distance, but the sign's sudden appearance bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Rowan climbed down from his truck and walked toward the sign, partly out of curiosity and partly because sitting still was making him stir-crazy. As he got closer, he could make out faded letters painted on the metal surface. Hume's Service Station, 2 miles, gas, repairs, food. The sign was so weathered that it was amazing the text was still legible at all, and Rowan estimated it had been standing beside this road for at least 30 or 40 years. But what bothered him was that he'd driven this route dozens of times over the past 7 years and had never seen this sign before. The possibility that there might be a service station just 2 miles ahead changed everything. If Hume's service station was still operating, or even if it was just abandoned but still standing, it would provide shelter while Rowan waited for help. There might even be tools or equipment that he could use to diagnose his truck's problems. Rowan walked back to his truck and made a decision. He would try to coax the engine forward for another 2 miles, hoping that whatever was causing the misfiring wouldn't get worse in that short distance. The truck responded sluggishly when Rowan put it in gear, the engine coughing and sputtering but maintaining just enough power to move forward. Rowan kept his speed down to about 15 miles per hour, nursing the truck along the frozen road while watching his gauges carefully for any sign that he was causing damage. The 2 miles felt much longer than they should have, every misfire making Rowan wince and expect the engine to die completely, but gradually a cluster of buildings appeared in the distance. Hume's service station sat on a flat piece of prairie about 50 yards off the main road, accessible by a snow-covered driveway that didn't look like it had been used in years. The station consisted of 3 buildings arranged in a rough semicircle. A main structure that appeared to house the office and garage bays, a smaller building that might have been a convenience store or restaurant, and what looked like a storage shed or workshop. All 3 buildings were old, their paint faded and peeling, but they appeared to be structurally intact despite obvious years of abandonment. Rowan guided his truck up the driveway, the tires crunching through crusty snow that was at least 6 inches deep. The station's parking area was large enough to accommodate several big rigs, and Rowan pulled into a spot near the main building where his truck would have some protection from the wind. As soon as he shut off the engine, the silence was overwhelming. No traffic noise from the road, no sound of oil field operations in the distance. Just wind whistling through the abandoned buildings and the occasional creak of metal expanding and contracting in the cold. Rowan sat in his cab for several minutes, studying the buildings and trying to understand why this place made him uneasy. The station looked like countless other abandoned businesses that dotted the rural highways of North Dakota, casualties of changing traffic patterns or economic downturns, or simple old age. But there was something off about it that Rowan couldn't identify, some quality that made his instincts warn him to be careful, even though there was no obvious danger. Finally, Rowan climbed down from his truck and approached the main building. The door to the office was unlocked, which surprised him, and it opened with a loud creak that echoed across the empty parking lot. Inside, the office looked frozen in time from some earlier decade. A metal desk sat against one wall, its surface covered with yellowed papers and faded receipts. An old cash register occupied the counter, its keys dusty but otherwise intact. A calendar on the wall showed October 1987. The pages never turned to mark the passage of months that became years, that became decades. But the most striking thing about the office was its condition. Despite being abandoned for what must have been 35 years or more, the space didn't show the kind of decay and damage that Rowan would have expected. There was dust, certainly, and the smell of old paper and stale air, but there was no water damage, no signs of vandalism, no evidence that animals had nested in the space. It was as if the building had been carefully preserved, maintained in its 1987 state by some force that kept the normal processes of decay at bay. Rowan walked through the office and into the garage area, where 2 service bays stood empty except for some old equipment and tools mounted on pegboards. A hydraulic lift occupied one bay, its machinery looking functional despite its age. Various automotive parts were scattered on workbenches, and Rowan noticed that many of them were for older vehicles, the kind of components that would have been current in the 1980s but were obsolete now. Everything was covered with dust, but again there was no serious deterioration, no rust or corrosion that should have accumulated over decades of abandonment. A door at the back of the garage led to what appeared to be a small apartment, probably living quarters for whoever had operated the station. Rowan pushed the door open and found a space that was both mundane and unsettling. A narrow bed with faded blankets, a kitchenette with dishes still in the drying rack, a small television from the 1980s sitting on a pressboard stand. The apartment looked like someone had just stepped out for a few minutes and would be back any moment, except that any moment had been stretching for more than 3 decades. Rowan returned to the garage and noticed something he'd missed during his initial survey. There was a phone mounted on the wall near the office door, an old rotary dial model that matched the vintage of everything else in the building. On impulse, Rowan picked up the receiver and held it to his ear, expecting dead silence. Instead, he heard a dial tone, clear and steady, as if the phone line was still active after all these years. His hand was shaking slightly as he dialed his dispatcher's number, watching the rotary dial spin back after each digit. The call connected, and Rowan heard ringing on the other end. But when someone answered, the voice that came through wasn't his dispatcher. It was a woman, older sounding, with an accent that suggested she'd lived her whole life in this part of North Dakota. "Hume's service station. This is Etta speaking. How can I help you?" Rowan stood frozen, the receiver pressed against his ear, trying to process what he was hearing. "I'm at your station right now," he said, slowly. "I broke down on County Road 39 and saw your sign, but the place looks like it's been abandoned for decades." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and Rowan could hear what sounded like pages being turned, like someone was checking a schedule or logbook. "County Road 39, Etta said finally, her voice carrying a quality that Rowan couldn't quite identify. Sadness, maybe, or resignation. "That's about 2 miles from here, and you say your truck broke down. Well, you're in luck. Tobias is here today, and he's the best mechanic in 3 counties. Bring your vehicle around and he'll have a look at it." Rowan wanted to explain that he was already at the station, that he'd driven his truck up the driveway and was standing in the garage right now. But before he could say anything, Etta continued speaking. "We close at 6 o'clock, so make sure you get here before then. Once we lock up for the night, we don't open again until morning. You don't want to be stuck outside in this cold." The line went dead after that, the dial tone returning as if the call had never happened. Rowan hung up the phone and walked outside, looking at his truck parked in the lot and then back at the buildings that surrounded him. He was already here, had been here for at least 20 minutes, but Etta had spoken as if he was still 2 miles away on County Road 39. And she'd mentioned closing at 6 o'clock, had warned him to arrive before then, as if the station was currently open for business despite being obviously abandoned. The sun was high in the sky now, probably close to noon based on the angle of shadows. Rowan checked his watch and saw that it showed 11:47 a.m., which matched his sense of how much time had passed since he'd left Williston that morning. He had more than 6 hours before Etta's supposed closing time, plenty of time to figure out what was happening at this strange abandoned service station that somehow still had working phone service and employees who spoke as if they were operating a functioning business. Rowan walked around the perimeter of the buildings, looking for any sign of recent activity or maintenance that would explain the station's preserved condition. But there was nothing, just undisturbed snow that showed only his own footprints and the tire tracks from his truck. No other vehicles had been here recently. No one had cleared the snow or maintained the buildings, yet everything remained intact, as if frozen in time at the moment it closed in 1987. As Rowan completed his circuit of the property, he noticed something that made his skin crawl. The sign he'd seen on the road, the weathered advertisement for Hume's service station, was no longer visible from this angle. He walked back out to the road and looked in the direction where the sign had been standing, but saw only empty prairie stretching to the horizon. The sign had vanished as completely as if it had never existed, leaving no post or foundation to mark where it had stood. Rowan returned to his truck and tried the engine, hoping that whatever had been causing the misfiring had somehow resolved itself. The engine turned over, but wouldn't start, wouldn't even catch for a moment before dying again. He was well and truly stuck now, parked at an abandoned service station that shouldn't exist, with a phone line that connected to people who spoke as if they were working at a business that had closed decades ago. And he had until 6 o'clock to figure out what was happening here, before whatever strange rules governed this place changed in ways that Rowan suspected he really didn't want to experience. Rowan sat in his truck cab with the engine off, watching his breath form clouds in the rapidly cooling air. The heater had been keeping things comfortable while the engine was running, but now that it was dead, the cold was seeping in through every seal and gap in the cab. The temperature gauge on his dashboard still showed 5 degrees outside, but Rowan knew from experience that sitting still in this kind of weather would become dangerous within a few hours. He needed to either get his truck running again or find another source of heat before the afternoon turned into evening, and the temperature dropped even further. He considered his options carefully. The phone in the garage had connected to someone claiming to be Etta at Hume's service station, speaking as if the business was currently operational. The logical explanation was that the phone line had somehow crossed with another business, that he'd reached a different service station somewhere else in North Dakota. But that didn't explain why Etta had known about County Road 39, or why she'd warned him to arrive before 6 o'clock when he was already sitting in the parking lot of what appeared to be the very station she was talking about. Rowan decided to explore the other buildings on the property, looking for tools or equipment that might help him diagnose his truck's problems. The smaller building that he'd identified as possibly being a convenience store or restaurant was locked, but the door was old enough that Rowan was able to force it open with his shoulder after a few solid hits. Inside, he found exactly what he'd expected. A small diner with a counter and 6 booths, a kitchen area visible through a service window, and shelves that had once held snacks and supplies for travelers. Like the office and garage, the diner appeared frozen in time from 1987. The menu board above the counter advertised prices that seemed impossibly low by modern standards. Coffee for 50 cents, hamburgers for $2, full breakfast for $3.50. The booths had red vinyl seats that were cracked with age but not torn or damaged by vandalism. Salt and pepper shakers still sat on each table, and Rowan could see plates and utensils visible through the kitchen window, as if the staff had just stepped away for a moment and would return to finish their shift. What struck Rowan as he explored the diner was the complete absence of dust in some areas. The counter and tables were covered with the expected layer of grime that came from decades of abandonment, but certain spots were clean, almost as if they'd been wiped down recently. A coffee cup sitting near the register was dusty on the outside but clean on the inside. One of the booths had a newspaper lying on its seat, and when Rowan picked it up he saw that it was a copy of the Williston Herald dated October 23, 1987. The paper was yellowed with age, but hadn't deteriorated the way newsprint normally would after 35 years. Rowan opened the paper and scanned the front page stories. An article about a local football team's winning season, a piece about construction starting on a new shopping center, an advertisement for a grand opening at a hardware store. All mundane, small-town news from 3.5 decades ago, preserved in print that should have crumbled to dust years before. But it was a smaller article near the bottom of the page that caught Rowan's attention and made his stomach drop. The headline read, "Service Station Owner Missing. Vehicle Found Abandoned." The article described how Tobias Hume, owner and operator of Hume's service station on County Road 39, had failed to open his business on October 22nd. Concerned customers had contacted authorities who found the station locked up with no sign of Hume. His truck had been discovered that afternoon, parked on County Road 39, about 2 miles from the station, engine running but driver missing. State police were investigating but had no leads on Hume's whereabouts. The article quoted Etta Lorne, Hume's sister and occasional employee at the station, saying she couldn't imagine where her brother would have gone, or why he would have abandoned his truck. Rowan read the article 3 times, his hands starting to shake slightly. Tobias Hume was the mechanic that Etta had mentioned on the phone, the man who was supposedly at the station today and ready to look at broken-down vehicles. But according to this newspaper, Tobias Hume had disappeared on October 22, 1907, and his truck had been found abandoned on County Road 39 in exactly the same way that Rowan's truck had broken down this morning. The parallels were too precise to be coincidental. Rowan pulled out his cell phone to take a picture of the newspaper article, then remembered that his phone had no signal out here. He folded the paper and tucked it into his jacket pocket, thinking that he might need evidence of what he was experiencing if he ever made it back to civilization. As he turned to leave the diner, he heard a sound that made him freeze in place. It was the unmistakable noise of a vehicle approaching, tires crunching through snow, an engine running with the distinctive rumble of an older truck. Rowan moved to one of the diner windows and looked out at the parking lot. A pickup truck had pulled in beside his rig, an old Ford from the 1980s with faded blue paint and a toolbox mounted in the bed. A man climbed out of the pickup, tall and lean, with a weathered face and gray hair showing beneath a stained baseball cap. He was wearing coveralls that might have been blue once, but had faded to a nondescript gray, and he moved with the careful economy of motion that came from years of physical labor in harsh conditions. The man walked around Rowan's truck slowly, examining it with the practiced eye of someone who'd been working on vehicles for decades. He popped the hood and leaned in to inspect the engine compartment, then walked back to his pickup and retrieved a toolbox. Rowan watched all this through the diner window, his mind trying to process what he was seeing. The man had to be Tobias Hume, matching the description Etta had given and arriving at the station just as she'd promised. But Tobias Hume had disappeared in 1987, which meant that what Rowan was watching through the window was either a ghost or something far stranger. Rowan forced himself to leave the diner and walk back across the parking lot toward his truck. As he approached, the man looked up from the engine compartment and nodded a greeting. "You must be the driver Etta called about. She said you broke down on County Road 39. Looks like you made it here all right, though." His voice was rough and deep, with the flat vowels of someone who'd spent his entire life in the upper Midwest. Up close, Rowan could see that the man's face was lined with age and weather, his hands scarred from decades of mechanical work. "Are you Tobias Hume?" Rowan asked, his voice coming out steadier than he felt. The man nodded. "That's right. And you are?" Rowan introduced himself, shaking hands with Tobias and feeling solid flesh and calluses, nothing ghostly or insubstantial about the contact. "I appreciate you taking a look at my truck. The engine started misfiring about an hour ago. I coaxed it here, but now it won't start at all." Tobias nodded thoughtfully and returned his attention to the engine compartment. "I've seen this before, with these Cummins diesels. Usually it's a fuel delivery issue. Could be the pump or the filters or something in the injection system. Let me run some diagnostics and see what we're dealing with." He worked in silence for several minutes, using tools from his box to check various components, his movements efficient and practiced. Rowan watched and tried to think of a way to ask the questions that were building up in his mind. How was Tobias here when he'd disappeared 35 years ago? Why did the service station look abandoned when Tobias and apparently Etta were still operating it? What had happened to create this impossible situation? Finally, Tobias straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag that he pulled from his coveralls. "I can fix this, but it's going to take a few hours. Problems with your fuel injection pump. I've got a rebuilt unit in my shop that should work, but I'll need to pull your old pump out and swap it. You're welcome to wait in the office where it's warm. Etta's got coffee on, and there's usually some food in the diner if you're hungry." Rowan looked toward the main building, remembering how abandoned it had appeared just an hour ago. "The office is open?" Tobias gave him a strange look. "Of course it's open. Where else would Etta be?" He gestured toward the building, and Rowan saw that lights were now visible through the windows, warm, yellow illumination that definitely hadn't been there during his earlier exploration. Smoke was rising from a chimney on the building's roof, and Rowan could see movement inside, a figure passing by one of the windows. "I'll be back in a minute," Rowan said, his voice not quite steady. "I need to grab something for my truck." Tobias nodded and returned his attention to the engine, already beginning the process of removing the fuel pump. Rowan climbed into his cab and sat down heavily in the driver's seat, trying to understand what was happening. The service station that had been clearly abandoned was now somehow operational, with lights and heat and people who claimed to be working here. Time itself seemed to be malfunctioning, showing Rowan two different versions of the same location overlapping in impossible ways. Rowan checked his watch and saw that it now showed 2:15 p.m., which meant he'd been at the station for over 3 hours. But it felt like much less time than that, as if the hours were passing at different rates depending on what he was doing or where he was looking. He tried his cell phone again and found that it still had no signal, but the battery was draining much faster than it should have been, dropping from 70% to 40% just in the time since he'd checked it in the diner. Finally, Rowan climbed down from his truck and walked toward the main building. steeling himself for whatever he was about to encounter. The door to the office opened easily, and inside he found a space that was completely different from what he'd seen on his first visit. The dust was gone, replaced by the lived-in clutter of an active business. The calendar on the wall still showed October 1987, but now it looked fresh rather than yellowed with age. The desk was organized, papers neatly stacked, and a coffee pot was burbling on a small table near the window. A woman stood behind the counter, probably in her mid-50s, with gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and wearing a cardigan over a simple dress. She looked up as Rowan entered and smiled warmly. "You must be the driver with the broken truck. I'm Etta Lorne. My brother Tobias said you made it here just fine. Can I get you some coffee while you wait? It's going to be a few hours before he has your truck fixed." Rowan accepted the coffee with the hands that were shaking slightly, wrapping his fingers around the warm mug and feeling the heat seep into his cold palms. The coffee was real, smelled fresh and strong, and when he took a sip, it tasted exactly like truck stop coffee had tasted for as long as Rowan had been driving. Etta busied herself with some paperwork behind the counter, making notes in a ledger book with a pen that left blue ink marks on the yellowed pages. "This is going to sound like a strange question," Rowan said carefully, "but what year is it?" Etta looked up from her ledger and gave him a puzzled smile. "What year? It's 1987, of course. October 1987. Are you feeling all right? Sometimes the cold affects people in funny ways, makes them confused or disoriented." Her concern seemed genuine, and Rowan realized that from her perspective she was talking to a customer who'd asked a nonsensical question. "I'm fine, Rowan," said, though he was anything but fine. "Just a little turned around from the cold and the truck trouble. How long has this station been here?" Etta's expression softened. "Tobias opened it in 1979, so we've been here about 8 years now. Business is good, especially with all the oil field traffic on these roads. We're usually pretty busy, though today's been quiet. You're the first customer we've had since this morning." Rowan took another sip of coffee and tried to think of how to approach what was happening. "Where are the other customers? The ones from this morning?" Etta shrugged. "They came and went like they always do, topped off their tanks, grabbed some food from the diner, paid their bills, and moved on. That's how it works in this business. People come when they need something, then they leave, and we probably never see them again." There was something in the way she said that last part that made Rowan's skin crawl. "Do you ever leave here? Go into Williston or visit other places?" Etta's smile faded slightly. "Oh, we can't leave. We have a business to run. Someone has to be here in case customers need help. That's why we're here, you understand, to help people who break down on these roads where there's no other services for miles. If we left, people might die out there in the cold." The way she emphasized those last words suggested that Etta understood something about her situation that she couldn't or wouldn't articulate directly. Rowan set down his coffee mug and pulled the newspaper from his jacket pocket, unfolding it on the counter so Etta could see the article about Tobias's disappearance. "I found this in the diner. It says your brother went missing on October 22nd, 1987. That's today's date, according to your calendar." Etta looked at the article, her expression unchanging, then looked back up at Rowan with eyes that seemed infinitely sad. "That story isn't true. Tobias didn't disappear. He's right outside working on your truck, same as he does for every driver who breaks down and makes it to our station. The newspaper got it wrong, or maybe they wrote about something that hasn't happened yet. Time doesn't work right here, you see. Days repeat sometimes, or they run backward, or they skip forward and then circle back. We stopped trying to understand it a long time ago." Rowan felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. "How long have you been here, Etta? How long have you and Tobias been running this station?" Etta looked out the window toward where Tobias was working on Rowan's truck, and her expression was distant. "We've been here for a very long time. Longer than we should have been, probably. But we can't leave, you see. We have work to do. Drivers who need help. And as long as people keep breaking down on County Road 39, we'll be here to fix their trucks and send them on their way." "What happens if someone can't leave before 6 o'clock?" Rowan asked, remembering Etta's warning from the phone call. "You said on the phone that the station closes at 6, and I shouldn't be stuck outside after that." Etta's expression became even sadder, if that was possible. "The station doesn't close at 6, Mr. Dillinger. That's when the day resets. Everything goes back to how it was at the beginning, and we start over again." October 22nd, 1987. Same day we've been living for 35 years. If you're still here when the reset happens, you become part of the loop. You'll be here with us, living the same day over and over, fixing trucks and serving coffee and never moving forward. Rowan's hands had gone completely numb despite the warm coffee mug. How do I avoid that? Etta glanced at the clock on the wall, which showed 2:47 p.m. Tobias needs to finish fixing your truck before 6 o'clock, and you need to drive away before the reset happens. If he can get you running by 5:30, you'll have enough time to get clear of the loop's influence. But if something delays the repair, if it takes too long, or if parts don't work right. She trailed off, leaving the rest unsaid. Rowan looked out the window and saw Tobias still working on his truck. Tools spread out around him, the old fuel pump already removed and sitting on the ground. Has anyone else gotten stuck here? Other drivers who didn't make it out before 6? Etta nodded slowly. A few over the years. They're here with us, living the same day. You probably passed them on your way in. They look like regular travelers, just stopping for gas or food, but they're trapped, same as us. They've forgotten mostly, forgotten that they ever had lives outside this loop. That's what happens after enough repetitions. The memories fade, and you start to believe that this is all there ever was. Rowan thought about the empty parking lot, the undisturbed snow, and realized that he hadn't seen any other vehicles or people when he'd first arrived at the station. But Etta was saying there were others here, trapped drivers who'd become part of the daily routine. Where are they now? The other trapped drivers? Etta gestured vaguely toward the diner. They come and go. Sometimes they're visible, sometimes they're not. It depends on where you are in the loop, whether you're experiencing the same moment they are. Time runs on different tracks here, parallel but not always intersecting. You might see them later, or you might not. It doesn't really matter. The casual way Etta talked about the breakdown of normal causality was almost more disturbing than the situation itself. She'd been trapped in this loop for 35 years, living the same day over and over, and she'd accepted it with a resignation that suggested she'd long since given up hope of escape. Rowan wondered how long it would take before he developed that same resignation. How many repetitions of October 22nd, 1987, it would take before he forgot that he'd ever driven other roads, or delivered other loads, or had a life that extended beyond this frozen moment in time. "I need to check on Tobias," Rowan said, setting down his coffee mug. "Make sure the repair is going smoothly." Etta nodded. "That's wise. Time moves differently when you're not paying attention. Hours can pass, in what feels like minutes. You'll want to stay aware, keep track of the clock. Make sure you're ready to leave when the time comes." Rowan stepped back outside and found that the light had changed in a way that suggested more time had passed than he'd realized. The sun was lower in the sky, the shadows longer, and when he checked his watch he was shocked to see that it showed 4:23 p.m. He'd been inside the office for over 2 hours, though it had felt like a conversation that lasted maybe 20 minutes. Time was definitely not flowing normally at Hume Service Station. Tobias was still working on the truck, but the repair seemed to be taking longer than it should have. The mechanic was moving slowly, almost methodically, as if he had all the time in the world to complete the job. Tools were arranged neatly around him. The old fuel pump sat beside the new one, but the actual installation seemed to be progressing at a glacial pace. Rowan approached and asked how much longer the repair would take. Tobias looked up and wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold temperature. Should be done in another hour or so. These injection pumps can be tricky to install properly. Don't want to rush it and have you break down again 10 miles down the road. An hour would put them right at the edge of Etta's deadline, with barely any margin for error. Rowan wondered if that was intentional, if the loop itself was somehow slowing down the repair to ensure that he wouldn't have time to escape. "Is there anything I can do to help?" Rowan asked, though he knew almost nothing about diesel engine repair. Tobias shook his head. "Best thing you can do is stay warm and stay ready to leave. When I get this installed and tested, you're going to want to drive out of here immediately. Don't stop, don't look back. Just get on that road and put as many miles as you can between yourself and this station before 6 o'clock. The urgency in Tobias's voice suggested that he understood the stakes, that he knew what would happen if Rowan was still here when the day reset. Rowan went back to his truck cab and gathered his important belongings, making sure he had his wallet, his phone, his paperwork, everything he would need if he had to abandon the truck and run. He also grabbed a tire iron from his toolkit, though he wasn't sure what good it would do against forces that could trap people in repeating days. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Rowan watched from his cab as Tobias worked, each movement careful and precise, and tried not to think about what would happen if they ran out of time. The sun continued its descent toward the horizon, the shadows lengthening across the frozen prairie, and Rowan's watch showed 5:17 p.m. when Tobias finally closed the hood and walked over to knock on the driver's side window. "Try it now," Tobias said, his face grim. "If the engine starts and runs smooth, you need to leave immediately. Don't wait, don't thank me, just drive." Rowan turned the key and felt a surge of relief as the engine turned over and caught, running with the smooth, steady rhythm that it should have had all along. He let it idle for a moment, listening carefully for any sign of the misfiring that had stranded him, but the engine sounded perfect. Rowan looked at Tobias through the window and saw something in the mechanic's expression that might have been envy or might have been relief. "Thank you," Rowan said, knowing the words were inadequate but not knowing what else to say. Tobias nodded once, then stepped back from the truck. "Go now, and don't come back to this road if you can help it. Some places aren't meant for the living." Rowan put his truck in gear and pulled away from Hume's service station without looking back, his eyes fixed on the snow-covered driveway that led back to County Road 39. The engine was running smoothly now, no trace of the misfiring that had stranded him here, and Rowan pushed his speed as fast as he dared on the slippery surface. His watch showed 5:19 p.m., which meant he had 41 minutes to get clear of whatever influence kept this place locked in an endless repetition of October 22nd, 1987. The driveway seemed longer than it had when Rowan had driven in that morning, the 50 yards stretching into what felt like hundreds of yards. He kept his foot steady on the accelerator, fighting the urge to floor it and risk losing control on the ice. The main road appeared ahead, and Rowan felt a surge of relief as his tires hit the relatively better surface of County Road 39. He turned south, back toward Williston, and checked his mirrors one final time. The service station was still visible behind him, lights glowing warmly in the growing dusk. Rowan could see Tobias standing in the parking lot watching him drive away, and through the office window he could make out Etta's silhouette behind the counter. They looked like normal people going about normal business. not souls trapped in a temporal prison that had held them for 35 years. Rowan wondered how many other drivers they'd helped over those decades, how many had made it out before the 6 o'clock reset, and how many had stayed too long and become permanent residents of October 22nd, 19. The sun was setting rapidly now, the winter day ending early as it always did this far north. The temperature was dropping along with the light, and Rowan could feel the cold intensifying even inside his heated cab. He pushed his speed up to 45 miles per hour, faster than was really safe on this rough road, but necessary if he wanted to put enough distance between himself and the station before whatever happened at 6 o'clock. Rowan had been driving for about 10 minutes when he noticed something that made his stomach clench with fear. The mile markers along the road weren't changing. He'd passed mile marker 43 when his truck had first broken down that morning, and he'd driven approximately 2 miles to reach the service station, which should have put him near mile marker 45, but as he drove south now, trying to flee the station's influence, he kept passing the same marker over and over. Mile marker 43, then a stretch of empty road, then mile marker 43 again, repeating in an impossible loop. Rowan checked his odometer and saw that it was advancing normally, showing that he'd traveled nearly 7 miles since leaving the station. But the external markers of progress, the numbered posts that should have been counting down as he approached Williston, were frozen at mile marker 43. It was as if the road itself was a treadmill, allowing his truck to move forward while keeping him in the same location relative to the larger world. The clock on his dashboard showed 5:34 p.m., 26 minutes until the reset that Etta had warned him about. Rowan tried his CB radio, hoping to reach another driver who might be somewhere on this road, someone who could confirm whether he was actually moving or just spinning his wheels in some kind of spatial loop. "This is Rowan Dillinger on County Road 39, requesting any driver in the area to respond. I need confirmation of my position. Over." The response came immediately, but it wasn't from another trucker. It was Etta's voice crackling through the speaker with that same sad resignation he'd heard in the station office. "You're not going to make it, Mr. Dillinger. The loop extends for 10 miles in every direction from the station. You can't drive fast enough to get clear before 6 o'clock. No one ever does. We always think there's enough time, but the road just keeps bringing us back." Rowan grabbed the CB microphone and keyed it with hands that had started shaking again. There has to be a way out. Other drivers must have escaped over the years. Someone must have figured out how to break free. Etta's response was barely audible through the static. Only one driver ever made it out, and that was back in 1989. We never understood how he did it. One moment he was here with us, the next he was gone. But everyone else who stayed past 6 o'clock is still here, driving the same roads, living the same day, waiting for time to start moving forward again. Rowan pushed his speed higher, up to 50 miles per hour, the truck bouncing and sliding on the rough, frozen surface. He was approaching mile marker 43 again, the same marker he'd now passed at least a dozen times. The repetition was making him dizzy and disoriented, the sense of motion without actual movement creating a disconnect between what his body felt and what his eyes were seeing. The sun had set completely now, leaving only the last traces of twilight on the western horizon, and Rowan's headlights cut through the darkness like searchlights trying to find a way out of a maze that had no exit. The clock showed 5:47 p.m., 13 minutes left. Rowan tried to think logically about his situation, to approach it like the mechanical problem it essentially was. If the road was looping, there had to be a point where the loop connected to itself, a seam or boundary where the repeating section began and ended. If he could identify that boundary, maybe he could find a way to break through it or circumvent it entirely. Rowan started paying closer attention to the landscape on both sides of the road, looking for any feature that might mark the edge of the loop. The prairie looked mostly uniform, flat, and snow-covered, but there were occasional landmarks. A dead tree, a fence post, an abandoned piece of farm equipment half buried in a drift. Rowan fixed these markers in his memory and watched for them to repeat, trying to map out the exact dimensions of the trap he was caught in. He'd just passed the dead tree for what must have been the 15th time when he saw something that didn't fit the pattern. There was a vehicle parked on the shoulder ahead, hazard lights flashing in the darkness. Rowan's first thought was that it was his own truck, that the loop had somehow circled back to show him his own breakdown from that morning. But as he got closer, he could see that this was a different vehicle, a semi-truck from an era that predated his own rig by at least a decade. Rowan slowed down as he approached the parked truck, and his headlights illuminated a man standing beside the driver's door. The man was waving his arms, flagging Rowan down, his expression desperate in the harsh illumination. Every instinct told Rowan to keep driving, that stopping would trap him here the same way stopping had trapped this other driver, but the man looked genuinely distressed, and the part of Rowan that had always stopped to help stranded motorists was warring with the part that knew helping meant risking his own escape. Rowan made a decision that he would question for years to come. He pulled over about 20 yards past the stranded truck and rolled down his window. "Are you all right?" he called out. The man hurried toward Rowan's truck, his boots crunching through the frozen snow, and Rowan could see that his face was weathered and lined with age beyond what his apparent years would suggest. "Thank God someone finally stopped," the man said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been here for hours. My truck broke down, and I can't get it started. Do you have a radio? Can you call for help?" Rowan glanced at his clock. 5:52 p.m. 8 minutes. "When did you break down?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The man thought for a moment. "Around 11 this morning. I was heading to Williston when the engine just died. I've been trying to flag down help ever since, but no one stopped until you." "What's today's date?" Rowan asked. The man gave him a confused look. "October 22nd. Why?" Rowan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "What year?" The man's confusion deepened. 1987. "Are you feeling okay? Did you hit your head or something?" Rowan closed his eyes briefly, understanding now what had happened to this driver. He'd broken down on County Road 39 on October 22nd, 1987, just like Tobias Hume had, just like Rowan himself had this morning. But instead of making it to the service station or managing to escape before 6 o'clock, this driver had been trapped on the road itself, living the same day over and over without even realizing it. 35 years had passed in the outside world, but this man was still experiencing the same October afternoon that he'd been living for decades. "I can't stop," Rowan said, his voice tight. "I'm sorry, but if I stop, I'll be trapped here with you. There's a service station about 2 miles north. If you can get your truck running, head there. They'll help you. But you need to leave before 6 o'clock. The man's expression shifted from confusion to something that might have been understanding or might have been fear. "What happens at 6 o'clock? Rowan checked his clock. 5:55 p.m. 5 minutes. "The day resets. Everything goes back to the beginning. If you're still here when it happens, you'll be stuck repeating this day forever." The man stepped back from Rowan's truck, his face pale in the reflected glow of the headlights. "How long have I been here? Really?" Rowan put his truck in gear, knowing he needed to keep moving, but unable to just drive away without giving this trapped driver some answer. 35 years. "I'm sorry." Rowan pulled back onto the road and accelerated, watching in his mirrors as the man stood motionless beside his broken truck, processing the truth about his situation. Rowan wondered how many others were trapped out here on this endless loop of highway. Drivers who'd broken down at the wrong time in the wrong place and had never managed to escape. The landscape of County Road 39 might be dotted with them, visible only at certain times or from certain angles, all of them caught in their own personal versions of hell. The clock showed 5:58 p.m. 2 minutes. Rowan was still passing mile marker 43 at regular intervals, still trapped in the same section of road that he'd been driving for the past 40 minutes. The panic was building in his chest now, making it hard to breathe, and he forced himself to focus on the one thing that might still save him: the driver who'd escaped in 1989. Etta had mentioned him specifically, had said no one understood how he'd gotten out. There had to be something different about what that driver had done, some action or decision that had broken the loop's hold. Rowan tried to think like that unknown driver might have thought. What would make someone attempt something different? Something that went against the obvious logic of trying to outrun the loop by driving faster. The answer came to him with sudden clarity. The successful driver hadn't tried to escape by going forward. He'd done something else entirely, something counterintuitive that had broken the pattern. The clock showed 5:59 p.m. 1 minute. Rowan made a decision based on nothing but intuition and desperation. Instead of continuing to drive forward, fleeing south toward Williston, he cranked his wheel hard to the left and drove his truck straight off the road into the prairie. The truck bounced and lurched over the uneven ground, snow spraying up around the hood, and Rowan fought the wheel to keep the heavy rig from tipping over or getting stuck. He was driving perpendicular to County Road 39 now, heading west across open prairie where no road existed, smashing through snowdrifts and frozen vegetation. The truck's headlights illuminated nothing but endless white landscape, and Rowan had no idea where he was going or what he was trying to accomplish. But staying on the road had been keeping him trapped, so the only option left was to leave the road entirely. The clock on his dashboard changed to 6 o'clock p.m. exactly, and Rowan braced himself for whatever the reset would bring. But nothing happened. No sudden shift in time or space, no feeling of being pulled back to the beginning. The truck just kept plowing forward through the prairie, and when Rowan glanced at his watch, he saw that the second hand was advancing normally. Time was flowing forward, not looping back to replay the same moment. Rowan kept driving across the prairie for another 10 minutes before he saw lights in the distance. Not the warm yellow glow of Hume's service station, but the harsh white lights of an oil drilling operation, modern equipment and workers moving about their business. Rowan adjusted his course toward the lights, and gradually a road appeared ahead, a proper, maintained gravel road that led to the drilling site. He pulled onto the road and felt his truck's tires grip solid ground for the first time in what felt like hours. A worker in a safety vest flagged Rowan down as he approached the drilling site. Rowan rolled down his window, and the worker gave him a puzzled look. "You're not supposed to be out here. This is a restricted work area. How did you even get onto this property?" Rowan looked back the way he'd come and saw only empty prairie stretching into the darkness. No sign of County Road 39, no indication that he'd been driving off-road for the past 10 minutes. "I took a wrong turn," Rowan said, which was probably the most honest answer he could give. "Can you tell me how to get back to Highway 85? The worker provided directions to the nearest main road, about 15 miles to the west. Rowan thanked him and followed the drilling site's access road until it connected with a county highway that actually appeared on his GPS. According to the navigation system, he was about 20 miles northeast of where County Road 39 should have been, as if he'd somehow jumped across space by driving perpendicular to the looping road. Rowan drove until he reached Highway 85, then turned south toward Williston. He didn't stop until he reached the first truck stop on the outskirts of town, pulling into the lot and killing his engine with hands that were shaking so badly he could barely turn the key. He sat in his cab for a long time, watching normal traffic move past on the highway, seeing other truckers fuel up and grab coffee and go about their business in a world where time flowed in one direction and roads led to destinations instead of endless loops. His cell phone had signal again, and when Rowan checked it, he saw that he had 17 missed calls from his dispatcher and numerous text messages asking where he was and why he hadn't checked in. According to his phone, it was 7:43 p.m. on January 15th, the same date as when he'd left Williston that morning. The entire experience at Hume's service station, all those hours trapped in the time loop, had somehow occurred without any time passing in the outside world. Rowan called his dispatcher and explained that he'd had mechanical trouble, but had managed to get it fixed and was now continuing to his delivery destination. The dispatcher was annoyed about the lack of communication but accepted Rowan's explanation without too many questions. After ending the call, Rowan sat alone in his cab and tried to process what had happened. He'd been trapped in a temporal loop that had held Tobias Hume and Etta Lorne for 35 years. He'd met other drivers who'd been caught in the same trap, some of them unaware that decades had passed while they lived the same day over and over. Rowan pulled out his phone and did a search for Hume's service station. The results were sparse, just a few historical references and a brief mention in an article about abandoned businesses in rural North Dakota. According to the article, the station had closed in late 1987 after the owner disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Several other people had gone missing in the area over the years, and local residents avoided County Road 39 during winter months, though the article didn't explain why. What bothered Rowan most was the realization that Tobias and Etta were still there, still trapped in their endless October day, still helping drivers who broke down and made it to their station before 6 o'clock. The mechanic had fixed Rowan's truck knowing that he himself would never escape, had sent Rowan on his way with urgency and something that might have been hope that at least one more person would make it out. Rowan wondered how many drivers over the past 35 years had received that same help, how many had escaped because Tobias Hume was still doing his job even though he'd been dead in the outside world since 1987. Rowan started his engine and pulled out of the truck stop, heading northeast toward his delivery destination. But he knew he'd never forget Hume's service station or the people trapped there. The experience had fundamentally changed how he understood the roads he drove, revealed that beneath the mundane surface of highways and delivery schedules, there existed places where reality itself malfunctioned. Places where time became a prison instead of a river flowing toward the future. As Rowan drove through the North Dakota night, his CB radio crackled to life even though he hadn't turned it on. Etta's voice came through the speaker, faint but clear. "Thank you for trying to warn the others, Mr. Dillinger. Most drivers who escape never think about the ones who are still trapped. But you stopped. You tried to help that driver on the road. That kindness means more than you know. Safe travels. And remember us when you drive these northern routes. Remember that some of us are still here, still waiting for time to start moving forward again." The radio went silent after that, no matter how Rowan tried to respond. He drove on through the darkness, carrying with him the knowledge that County Road 39 held secrets that would never appear in any official records. Tobias Hume and Etta Lorne would continue their endless October day, fixing trucks and serving coffee, helping drivers who broke down in the wrong place at the wrong time. And scattered along that road were others who hadn't made it to the station or hadn't left before 6 o'clock, all of them trapped in their own personal loops, unaware that the world had moved on without them. Rowan made his delivery and returned to Williston, then immediately requested a route change from his dispatcher. He would never drive County Road 39 again, would never risk returning to that stretch of highway where time refused to flow normally. But he knew the road was still there, still claiming drivers who made the mistake of breaking down at mile marker 43, still offering the false hope of rescue at a service station that existed in 1987, but nowhere else. 3 months passed before Rowan could bring himself to talk about what had happened at Hume's service station. He'd completed his delivery that night, returned to Williston, and immediately requested reassignment to routes that kept him away from the remote oil patch roads where County Road 39 waited for drivers who made the mistake of breaking down in the wrong location. His dispatcher had questioned the sudden change, had pointed out that the oil field contracts paid significantly better than standard freight hauling, but Rowan had been adamant. No amount of money was worth the risk of returning to that stretch of highway where time itself had become a trap. The nightmares started about a week after his escape. Always the same scenario, with minor variations that somehow made each iteration worse than the last. Rowan would be driving through the North Dakota prairie, hauling a load to some distant drilling site when his engine would start to misfire. He'd pull over to investigate and find himself at Hume's service station, the buildings appearing out of the snow like they'd been waiting for him all along. Tobias would be there, tools in hand, ready to fix whatever had broken. Etta would offer coffee and make small talk about the weather. And Rowan would watch the clock tick toward 6 p.m., knowing that he wouldn't make it out in time, that this repetition would be the one where he became a permanent resident of October 22nd, 1907. He'd wake up from these dreams drenched in sweat despite the cold temperature in his sleeper berth, his heart hammering against his ribs like it was trying to break free. The worst part was the growing uncertainty about whether his escape had been real or just another layer of the loop. Maybe he was still there at the station, living out some fantasy of escape while his body remained trapped in that parking lot, going through the same motions day after day without realizing that time had stopped moving forward. Rowan started researching the history of County Road 39 and Hume's service station, spending his downtime at truck stops and rest areas digging through online archives and historical records. What he found only deepened the mystery and made his unease grow stronger. The station had indeed existed, operated by Tobias Hume from 1979 until his disappearance in October 1987. But the details of that disappearance were stranger than Rowan had realized from the brief newspaper article he'd found in the station's diner. According to police reports that Rowan managed to access through a contact in law enforcement, Tobias Hume's truck had been found running on County Road 39 with the engine in perfect working order. There was no mechanical failure that would explain why Hume had abandoned his vehicle. His wallet and personal belongings were still in the cab, and there were no signs of struggle or foul play. Tobias had simply vanished, as if he'd stepped out of his truck and walked into another dimension. Search teams had combed the area for weeks, but found no trace of him. No footprints in the snow, no evidence that he'd wandered away from his vehicle and succumbed to exposure. What bothered Rowan most was a detail buried deep in the supplementary reports. Several witnesses had called the police on October 22nd to report that they'd stopped at Hume's service station that morning for fuel and service, had interacted with Tobias and his sister Etta, and had paid for their purchases before continuing their journeys. But when investigators interviewed these witnesses more carefully, inconsistencies emerged in their stories. They couldn't provide receipts for their purchases. They couldn't remember specific details about their interactions. And when pressed about the exact timing of their visits, their memories became fuzzy and contradictory. The police had ultimately dismissed these reports as mistaken recollections, or cases of people confusing Hume's station with other similar businesses. But Rowan understood what had really happened. Those witnesses had encountered the time loop, had stopped at the station during one of its manifestations, and had somehow made it out before 6 o'clock. Their memories of the experience were degraded because they'd witnessed something that shouldn't have been possible, and their minds had tried to rationalize it into something that made sense within normal causality. Rowan also found references to other disappearances on County Road 39 dating back decades before Tobias Hume's vanishing. In 1972, a family of 4 had abandoned their car on that stretch of highway during a winter storm. The vehicle was found running with the heater on, but all 4 occupants were gone without explanation. In 1965, a truck driver had reported engine trouble on County Road 39 and was never seen again. His rig discovered days later with its cargo intact and no signs of the driver. In 1953, 2 highway patrol officers investigating a reported stranded motorist had vanished on that road, their patrol car found idling with the lights still flashing. The pattern suggested that whatever had trapped Tobias and Etta at their service station was much older than their business, that the temporal anomaly on County Road 39 had existed long before the 1980s and had been claiming victims for generations. Rowan wondered how far back the disappearances went, whether there were records from the 1920s or earlier documenting similar incidents. The road itself had probably been there in some form for a century or more, first as a wagon trail, then as a rough track for early automobiles, eventually paved and incorporated into the county road system. How many travelers over those decades had broken down in the wrong spot and found themselves trapped in an endless loop of time? It was late March when Rowan received a call from a trucker he'd met years earlier at a fuel stop in Minnesota. The man's name was Dale Pritchard, and he specialized in hauling equipment to remote drilling sites across the northern plains. Dale had heard through the trucking community's informal network that Rowan was refusing oil patch contracts and had specifically requested to avoid routes through northwestern North Dakota. He wanted to know why, and something in his tone suggested that he already had suspicions about the answer. Rowan met Dale at a truck stop in Fargo, far enough from County Road 39 that Rowan could discuss what had happened without feeling like the road itself might somehow overhear the conversation. They sat in a booth at the back of the diner section, coffee cups between them, and Rowan told the entire story from beginning to end. The engine trouble, the mysterious sign advertising Hume's service station, the buildings that appeared abandoned but became fully operational once he was trapped inside their influence, the newspaper article about Tobias Hume's disappearance, the phone call to Etta, the repair that took just long enough to bring him to the edge of the 6 o'clock deadline, the desperate drive trying to escape the loop, passing the same mile marker over and over, the trapped driver who'd been living October 22, 1987 for 35 years without knowing it. And finally, the counterintuitive decision to drive perpendicular to the road, breaking the loop by refusing to play by its rules. Dale listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious as the story progressed. When Rowan finished, Dale sat in silence for a long moment, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he'd been carrying for years. Finally, he looked up and spoke in a voice so quiet that Rowan had to lean forward to hear him clearly. "I've been on that road. Not County Road 39 specifically, but other roads like it. Roads where time doesn't flow right, where breaking down means more than just mechanical failure. I've seen things out there in the oil patch that I can't explain, encounters with people and places that shouldn't exist. And I've known drivers who disappeared, good professional drivers who just vanished without explanation while running those remote routes." Dale pulled a small notebook from his jacket pocket and flipped through pages covered with handwritten notes and sketches. "I started documenting this stuff about 10 years ago, after my first encounter with something impossible. There's a stretch of Highway 22 in Montana where truck stops appear and disappear, depending on when you're driving through. There's a section of Route 200 in North Dakota where some drivers report losing hours of time without any memory of what happened. There's County Road 15 in South Dakota, where multiple truckers have reported seeing convoys of trucks from the 1950s that vanish when you try to follow them. The pattern is always the same: remote roads, harsh weather conditions, and temporal anomalies that trap people or make them disappear. Rowan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Are you saying there are multiple locations like Hume's service station? Multiple places where people are trapped in time loops? Dale nodded slowly. At least a dozen that I've documented, probably more that I haven't found yet. The northern plains are full of these dead zones, places where reality doesn't work the way it should. Most truckers who encounter them either die or escape and never talk about it because they're afraid of being labeled as crazy. But the disappearances keep happening, year after year, and nobody in authority acknowledges that there's a pattern. Dale slid his notebook across the table to Rowan. I want you to add your experience to this record. Write down everything you can remember about Hume's service station, about the layout of the buildings, about Tobias and Etta, about how you managed to escape. Maybe, if we collect enough information, we can start to understand what these places are and how they work. Maybe we can figure out how to warn other drivers, or even how to shut these locations down permanently. Rowan accepted the notebook and spent the next 2 hours writing out a detailed account of his time at the station, including observations and details that he hadn't mentioned in his verbal telling of the story. The way the dust in the office seemed to exist in some areas but not others, as if different parts of the building were experiencing different points in time. The sound of wind that seemed to carry voices speaking languages he couldn't identify. The way Etta's eyes had reflected sadness and resignation. The expression of someone who'd accepted imprisonment without giving up hope that others might escape. The feeling of time moving at different speeds depending on what he was doing or where he was looking. When Rowan finished writing, Dale read through the account carefully, occasionally asking questions or requesting clarification on specific details. Finally, he closed the notebook and looked at Rowan with an expression that might have been respect or might have been pity. You're lucky you figured out the trick of driving perpendicular to the road. Most people who try to escape these loops stay on the roads because that's what makes sense logically. Roads are for driving, so they keep driving forward, trying to outrun whatever is chasing them. But the loops are anchored to the roads themselves, so staying on them means staying trapped. The only way out is to break the connection by leaving the road entirely. How did you learn that? Rowan asked. Dale's expression darkened. Trial and error mostly. I got caught in a temporal loop on Highway 22 back in 2011. Spent what felt like 6 hours driving through the same 30-mile stretch of highway, passing the same landmarks over and over. My fuel gauge showed I should have been running on empty, but the needle never moved below a quarter tank. Time was looping, but physical processes were still occurring, which meant I was burning fuel without the gauge reflecting it. When I finally realized what was happening, I drove straight off the highway into a field, and the loop broke. Turned out I'd only been gone for about 45 minutes in real time, but it felt like I'd been driving for most of a day. Dale leaned back in the booth and rubbed his eyes tiredly. The thing that keeps me up at night is wondering how many drivers are still trapped in these loops right now. How many people are living the same day or hour or minute over and over, unaware that time has stopped for them while the rest of the world moves on. Tobias Hume and his sister have been trapped since 1987, but they're not the only ones. There are probably dozens or hundreds of people scattered across the northern plains, all of them caught in their own personal time prisons, all of them invisible to the outside world. Rowan thought about the driver he'd encountered during his escape attempt, the man who'd been flagging for help on County Road 39. That driver had been trapped for 35 years without knowing it, living the same October afternoon in an endless repetition. How many times had he flagged down passing vehicles only to have them drive past without stopping? How many times had someone finally stopped, only to flee when they realized the danger, leaving him alone again to wait for the next set of headlights to appear through the snow? "We need to do something," Rowan said, though he didn't know what that something could be. "We can't just document these places and warn people to avoid them. We need to find a way to help the people who are trapped, to break the loops and free them." Dale's smile was sad and knowing. "That's what everyone says at first. But what can we do? We don't understand what causes these temporal anomalies or how to reverse them. We don't even know if the people trapped in the loops can be saved, or if they've become so integrated with the anomalies that freeing them would kill them. All we can do is map out the dangerous locations, warn other drivers when we can, and try to stay out of the traps ourselves." The conversation continued for another hour, with Dale sharing stories of other drivers who'd encountered temporal anomalies on northern roads. A woman who'd driven into a truck stop that claimed to be in 1962 and had barely escaped before the decade trapped her. A man who'd followed a convoy of military trucks through Montana only to discover they were vehicles from World War II still running their original routes 70 years later. A driver who'd stopped to help what appeared to be a stranded family, only to discover they were people who'd frozen to death in 1978 and were somehow still walking around asking for assistance. Each story added another layer to Rowan's understanding that the northern plains were riddled with these temporal wounds, places where time had been damaged or corrupted and now functioned according to rules that had nothing to do with normal causality. The oil boom had brought thousands of new drivers into this territory, exposing more people to the phenomenon and increasing the rate of disappearances. But the anomalies themselves were much older, dating back to periods before modern transportation, suggesting that whatever caused them was connected to the landscape itself rather than human activity. When Rowan finally left the truck stop and returned to his rig, he found an envelope tucked under his windshield wiper. The envelope was old and yellowed, and when Rowan opened it, he found a single sheet of paper covered with handwriting that looked like it had been done with a fountain pen. The note read, "Thank you for remembering us. Thank you for trying to warn others. We're still here at the station, still helping drivers when we can, still hoping that someday time will start moving forward again. Be careful on these northern roads. The winter is long, and there are many places like ours, many people trapped in moments that never end. Drive safe, and remember that some of us are still waiting for rescue, even though we know it may never come. Etta Lorne." Rowan's hands were shaking as he read the note. He'd been hundreds of miles from County Road 39 when he met with Dale. Had been sitting inside a busy truck stop surrounded by normal traffic and normal people. But somehow Etta had found a way to reach him, to send a message across space and possibly time itself. The implication was that the boundaries between the loops and normal reality were more permeable than Rowan had realized, that the trapped people weren't completely isolated from the world that had moved on without them. Over the following months, Rowan became more involved with Dale's documentation project, adding his own observations and collecting stories from other drivers who'd encountered temporal anomalies. They created an online forum where truckers could share information about dangerous locations and unusual encounters, using coded language to avoid drawing attention from authorities or skeptics who would dismiss their accounts as delusions or fabrications. The forum grew slowly but steadily, attracting drivers from across the northern states who had their own stories about roads that didn't behave normally. What emerged from these collected accounts was a disturbing picture of just how widespread the phenomenon was. Nearly every remote highway in North Dakota, Montana, and South Dakota had at least one reported location where time functioned abnormally. Some were small anomalies that only affected people for a few minutes or hours. Others were massive, temporal wounds like Hume's service station, where people could be trapped for decades. The pattern suggested that the anomalies were connected somehow, that they formed a network or web across the northern plains, all of them linked by forces that no one understood. Rowan continued to drive routes that kept him away from the most dangerous locations, but he couldn't avoid the northern states entirely without giving up trucking altogether. His work took him through Montana and North Dakota on a regular basis, always following main highways and avoiding the remote county roads where most of the anomalies seemed to be concentrated. But even on the major interstates, Rowan would occasionally see signs of the temporal wounds. Rest areas that appeared and disappeared depending on when you were looking for them. Mile markers that repeated in sequences that didn't match the actual distance traveled. Radio stations that broadcast programs from decades earlier. It was early December, almost a full year after his encounter at Hume's service station, when Rowan received a call from Dale asking him to investigate something unusual. A trucker had posted on their forum about a service station on Highway 2 in Montana that seemed to be caught in a temporal loop similar to the one at Hume's. The trucker had stopped there for fuel and had noticed that the prices were impossibly low and the staff were wearing clothing from the 1990s. He'd left quickly without fueling up, disturbed by the sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the location. Dale wanted Rowan to drive past the station during daylight hours and document what he saw, to determine if this was another permanent loop or just a temporary manifestation. Rowan was reluctant to get more deeply involved with investigating these anomalies, but he owed Dale for sharing information that might save other drivers from the fate that had almost trapped him. He agreed to make the drive, carefully planning his route to ensure he'd pass the reported location during mid-afternoon, when traffic would be heaviest and the temporal effects might be weakest. He also made sure his fuel tank was completely full, that his truck was in perfect mechanical condition, and that he had multiple communication devices in case he needed to call for help. The drive to the reported location took most of a day, following Highway 2 through Montana's northern tier. The landscape was familiar from dozens of previous trips, rolling prairie dotted with small towns and occasional clusters of oilfield equipment. As Rowan approached the coordinates that Dale had provided, he slowed down and began watching carefully for any sign of a service station. The trucker who'd reported the location had been certain about the mile marker, had provided specific details about the station's appearance and the sign that advertised its services. But when Rowan reached the specified location, he found only empty prairie. No service station, no buildings of any kind, just windswept grassland stretching to the horizon. He pulled over and checked his GPS coordinates against the information Dale had given him. The numbers matched perfectly, confirming that he was in the right location. But there was nothing here, no sign that a business had ever existed on this spot. Rowan sat in his parked truck and watched the empty landscape for 30 minutes, waiting to see if the service station would manifest the way Hume's had appeared from seemingly nowhere. The sun was high in the clear winter sky, and the temperature was cold but not brutally so. Normal mid-December weather for this part of Montana. Nothing unusual or threatening about the scene. Yet Rowan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something just beyond his perception was observing him and waiting to see what he would do. Finally, Rowan climbed down from his cab and walked 50 yards out into the prairie, studying the ground for any evidence that buildings had once stood here. What he found made his skin crawl. There were foundation marks in the snow-covered ground, rectangular depressions that suggested structures had existed here at some point. The depressions were arranged in a pattern that matched a typical service station layout: a main building, a smaller outbuilding, possibly fuel pump islands. But the foundations looked old, as if they'd been abandoned for decades. Rowan took photographs with his phone and was about to return to his truck when he heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the distinctive ding of a service station bell, the kind that rang when vehicles drove over a pressure hose. Rowan spun around and saw that the empty prairie was no longer empty. A service station had materialized about 100 yards from where he was standing, its buildings looking solid and real despite having been completely invisible just moments before. The station appeared to be from the 1990s, based on the architectural style and the design of the signs. A main building with large windows, a canopy covering fuel pumps, and a smaller building that looked like it might house repair bays. There was a single vehicle parked at the pumps, an older sedan that matched the vintage of the station itself, and standing beside the sedan was a person, though from this distance Rowan couldn't make out any details about their appearance. Every instinct Rowan had developed over the past year told him to get back in his truck and leave immediately. This was the same pattern as Hume's service station, a location that appeared normal but existed in a different temporal framework than the surrounding world. If Rowan approached the station, if he interacted with the people there or accepted their services, he risked becoming trapped in whatever loop held them. But he'd come here specifically to document this location, to gather information that might help other drivers avoid it. Leaving without learning anything would mean wasting the trip and potentially leaving other truckers at risk. Rowan made a decision that he'd question for years to come. He walked toward the service station slowly, his phone in his hand recording video of everything he saw. As he got closer, more details became visible. The fuel prices posted on the pump islands were from the mid-1990s, less than $1 per gallon. The signs advertising services and amenities were faded but legible, mentioning products and brands that hadn't existed for decades. And the person standing beside the sedan was a woman, middle-aged, wearing clothing that matched the era of the station. The woman looked up as Rowan approached, and her expression cycled through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise, then confusion, then something that might have been hope, or might have been fear. "Can you see me?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the distance between them despite the wind. "Can you actually see me standing here?" Rowan stopped about 20 feet from the woman, maintaining enough distance to run if necessary, but close enough to communicate. "Yes, I can see you, and I can see your service station. When is it? What year do you think this is?" The woman's eyes filled with tears. "It's 96, September 14th, 96. That's what the calendar says inside, that's what my watch shows. But you're dressed wrong for 1996. Your truck looks too modern. And the way you're asking the question makes me think that maybe it's not 1996 for you." Rowan felt a profound sadness wash over him. This woman had been trapped here for almost 30 years, living the same September day over and over, unaware that the world had moved on without her. "It's December 2024, Rowan said gently. "I'm sorry. I think you're caught in a temporal loop, the same kind of thing that trapped people at Hume's service station in North Dakota. How did you end up here?" The woman wiped at her eyes with hands that were shaking. "I don't remember. I was driving through Montana, heading to visit family in Washington. My car started having problems. Overheating, I think. I saw this service station and pulled in for help. The mechanic said he could fix it, said it would just take a couple of hours. I waited in the office, and she trailed off, confusion evident on her face. I've been waiting ever since, but it doesn't feel like years. It feels like I just got here today. Every day feels like I just got here today." Rowan understood what was happening. The woman was experiencing September 14th, 1996, fresh each time the day reset, with no memory of the previous iterations. She wasn't aware that she'd lived this same day thousands of times, had asked the same questions and received the same answers in an endless loop. The only reason she recognized that something was wrong now was because Rowan existed outside her loop, his presence disrupting the normal flow of her trapped day. "Can you leave?" Rowan asked. "Can you get in your car and drive away from here?" The woman looked at her sedan, then back at Rowan. The mechanic said he needed to finish the repair first. He said, "If I leave before it's fixed, the car will break down again, and I'll be stranded somewhere worse. I've been waiting for him to finish the work." She glanced toward the repair bay, which Rowan could now see had a figure moving around inside, a man in coveralls working on something mechanical. Rowan realized that this woman was trapped by the same rules that had governed Hume's service station. The repair would never be finished in time, would always take just long enough to keep her here until the day reset, and the reset would erase her memory of this conversation, would return her to the beginning of September 14th, 1996, would condemn her to repeat the same pattern tomorrow and forever, unless someone found a way to break the loop. "What's your name?" Rowan asked. The woman smiled sadly. "Eleanor. Eleanor Vickers. And you are?" Rowan told her his name and briefly explained what he'd learned about temporal loops over the past year. He described Hume's service station and the people trapped there, explained how he'd escaped by driving perpendicular to the road, suggested that Eleanor might be able to break free if she abandoned her car and walked away from the station in any direction except along the highway. But even as Rowan spoke, he could see Eleanor's attention wavering, her eyes losing focus as if she was having trouble staying present in this moment. The loop was reasserting its hold on her, pulling her back toward the script she'd been following for 28 years. "I should check on the repair," she said, her voice distant. "The mechanic said it wouldn't take long. I need to get back on the road. My family is expecting me." Rowan watched helplessly as Eleanor walked toward the repair bay, her movements becoming more automatic and less purposeful. Within moments, she disappeared inside the building, and Rowan knew that by the time he followed her, the station would be empty again. The manifestation over. Eleanor trapped in another iteration of September 14th, 1996. The loop had defended itself against his intrusion, had pulled its prisoner back before Rowan could do anything to help her escape. Rowan returned to his truck and sat in the cab for a long time, staring at the empty prairie where the service station had been visible just minutes before. He'd documented the location, had video evidence of the station's appearance and his conversation with Eleanor. But he'd failed to help her, had watched her slip back into her temporal prison without being able to do anything to prevent it. The weight of that failure sat heavy on his chest, making it hard to breathe. Over the following months, Rowan and Dale added Eleanor Vickers to their growing list of people trapped in temporal loops across the northern plains. The list included Tobias Hume and Etta Lorne, the unnamed driver Rowan had encountered during his escape from County Road 39, and dozens of others that various truckers had reported over the years. Each name represented someone who'd broken down in the wrong place at the wrong time. Someone whose life had been frozen in an endless repetition while the world moved on without them. Rowan continued driving his routes through the northern states, always careful to maintain his truck perfectly and to avoid the locations they'd identified as temporal anomalies. But he knew that perfect maintenance and careful route planning wouldn't protect him forever. The anomalies seemed to be growing more common, appearing in places that had previously been safe, suggesting that whatever caused them was spreading or intensifying. Sooner or later, Rowan would break down again in the wrong location, would find himself trapped in a loop that he might not escape from. The question that haunted Rowan most was what he would do if he ever encountered Hume's service station again. Would he stop and visit Tobias and Etta, the people who'd helped him escape their trap? Would he try to find a way to free them, knowing that any attempt might trap him alongside them? Or would he drive past without stopping, preserving his own freedom while abandoning them to their endless October day? Rowan didn't have answers to these questions, knew that he probably wouldn't until he was actually faced with the choice. All he could do was keep driving, keep documenting, keep warning other truckers about the dangers that waited on these frozen northern roads, and hope that someday someone would figure out how to break these temporal prisons and free the people who'd been trapped in them for years or decades. The northern plains stretched out before Rowan as he drove through the winter darkness, empty highways cutting through vast expanses of frozen prairie. The landscape looked normal and mundane, just another stretch of rural America that connected one town to another. But Rowan knew the truth that lay beneath that mundane surface. The roads were haunted, time was broken, and somewhere out there in the cold and dark, people were still trapped in moments that had ended decades ago, still waiting for help that might never arrive, still living the same days over and over in prisons made of time itself.